Okay, it's 9:35. Andrew, Stephen, would you like me to get started, or do you want to wait a couple more minutes? See, we have about 50 people on.
Yeah, John, that's fine.
Yeah, I would say get started.
Okay, I'll go
People
ahead
will
and get
pick up as
started
they get
then.
in. Yeah.
Gotcha. My remarks are going to be the least important probably anyway. So if they're going to miss something, this would be the thing to miss. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is John Brennan. I'm with the Maryland Department of Disabilities. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the department, and I oversee our non-visual access IT initiative. I'd like to welcome you to today's accessibility education seminar, and thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to talk about Maryland's non-visual access clause for people who are blind and visually impaired. And more specifically, we'll provide both a broad overview and also tips, advice, information on how to implement it and incorporate it into your work processes. This training is part of the state's or the Department of Disabilities non-visual access initiative, which started in 2020. But the non-visual access clause itself has been in existence since the late 1990s. It's just recently that we really started to try to focus on providing a pathway for all of our IT practitioners in the state, with state agencies specifically, to help Maryland really become a leader in this area. So we started the initiative in 2020, but as everyone knows, the pandemic happened and that disrupted sort of the world as we know it, as well as how we operate. And so the rollout of this initiative has been delayed. But in a sense, the fact that we went through the pandemic highlighted the importance of accessibility for people who are blind and visually impaired, as well as, more importantly, what I think is probably the most important aspect is making sure that we think about accessibility from the beginning as we approach our work, either in procuring, developing, or implementing any information technology solution. Just to give you an example of some of the things that were stressed during the pandemic, we had to deploy as a state. It was a rapid deployment of resources on a very large scale to meet a very large public health threat. And so these solutions were put out there, both in terms of there was a lot of information that was put out, as well as actual services that were provided to people in order to help combat the spread of COVID and treat people um, who were infected with the COVID virus. And so what we learned is that when you do that, if you don't incorporate accessibility into the process from the beginning, you end up, even though you have the best intentions, you end up putting out information that isn't accessible to everyone. For example, executive orders and guidance from the Maryland Department of Health that were put in PDFs had to be remediated after the fact. Certain web applications that allowed people to locate vaccination sites or testing sites, we had to remediate after the fact. And it really stressed for us what we think and what I hope at the end of the day, as you go through this training, if it's one thing you can take away, is that the number one barrier, I think, to successfully ensuring that we procure information technology and solutions that are accessible, that we implement information and technology solutions that are accessible, is that we consider that from the beginning of the process, from the design process, or if it's a procurement, from the way that we write the request for a proposal, to make sure that that the potential offerers know that this product A needs to be accessible, and B, what is it that would make this product accessible, that we communicate that in our RFP. And so part of this training in our overall initiative is to help our state partners accomplish that very goal through training, outreach, and more importantly, technical assistance, either testing a website for accessibility or helping to test a product that we might be purchasing for accessibility. So we're going to cover a lot of topics in today's training beyond the broad overview of the NVA clause. Like I said, we hope to provide you with an understanding of where and how to incorporate accessibility into your work processes, learning the technical standards and associated techniques used for compliance, and learning about the ongoing resources and services available to state agencies that we provide. And so we have two trainers here with you today that are part of our staff. Andrew Drummond, who is our Director of IT Accessibility Policy and Programs, as well as Stephen Polacek, who is their IT accessibility evaluator. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to them. But again, I just want to welcome you and thank you for taking the time to attend this seminar. We think you'll get a lot of valuable information. We hope that it's helpful. And if there are any aspects of this training that we can improve on, please let us know. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew and Stephen.
Thank you very much, John. Next slide, please.
Yep. Sorry.
So what is digital accessibility? Great question. Digital accessibility in a nutshell is that kind of forethought and inclusive practice of ensuring that an organization attempts to remove all the barriers that would prevent access to websites, digital solutions, IT solutions by people with disabilities. In practice, making a product have a great user experience that includes an IT solution that works for everyone and is able to deal with addressing a wide range of challenges. We constantly in this IT accessibility realm, we're dealing with access versus accommodation, and as practitioners in this field, we would always say that access is definitely the best way to go, and access is that ability to use the product right off the shelf, product or service right off the shelf, and accommodations are great. However, they're really more of a workaround, or potentially using another IT solution to make the existing IT. So you start with IT solution A, and then you have to use IT solution B to make IT solution A accessible. That's an accommodation. That is not, that's not best practice, but that's sometimes what we do see. Conditions that they can impact digital accessibility. There's kind of four main areas. The first would be, obviously today's session is a lot about big focus on Maryland's non-visual access clause, and that would be in the first condition obviously is blindness and low vision. Blindness and low vision and non-visual access can definitely impact digital accessibility, especially if an IT solution is not created in the proper manner. Cognition and cognitive, people with cognitive challenges can definitely have challenges in interacting with IT solutions. Fine motor solutions, perhaps this could be only having the ability to use one hand, perhaps having hand tremors, perhaps having other fine motor challenges that would impact perhaps using a traditional input control, such as just a regular mouse and keyboard. Perhaps an end user needs to use an assistive technology device. Perhaps they're using a head mouse, or they're using switch controllers, sip and puff, of a variety of input controls that allows them to access the digital content. And then we have deaf and hard of hearing, which could be potential barriers to accessing IT solutions. So what are the laws and guidelines? So the next few slides, we're going to kind of just really talk on a higher level about the different laws and guidelines here in Maryland, nationally and internationally. At the state level, we're really super. John has already chatted about Maryland's non-visual access clause, but just to talk a little more. Within the state, we are very fortunate to have an accessibility law. Quite a few states don't have an accessibility law. We're one of the few that do. It's very exciting to be part of a state that's really focused on leveling up our digital footprint and really making sure that all Marylanders can access our content, which is in our digital footprint. So NVA has been revised at least once or twice. The most recent was, I believe, updated in 2018. Maryland's non-visual access clause effectively means that state agencies within the executive branch are charged with ensuring that their digital footprint is accessible for all. Also, John also prefaced talking about procurement. It's obviously part of state law that these agencies that are under the umbrella of the NVA have to procure accessible IT solutions. Maryland's NVA clause, as of the 2018 update, actually allows the control agency to levy financial penalties against vendors, vendors that work with the state, that provide the state with an inaccessible IT solution. So perhaps it's, hypothetically, an IT solution was claimed to be, accessible, and then it was later determined that the product was inaccessible. Then it's, the vendor would have to remediate the product, as soon as humanly possible, and work with the agency to remedy that. And during this time, it is possible for quite hefty financial penalties to be levied against that vendor. So I think it's a great accessibility law. It gives state of Maryland's control agency some teeth to really enforce accessibility, and it's definitely helping Maryland lead the way in regards to accessibility within the region. So at the federal level, looking at the registration, it looks like we might have a couple of folks from the federal government here today. So thinking about the federal level, we have a couple of different laws. We have obviously the most famous and most well-known, which would be Section 508 of the Rehab Act. Ultimately, Section 508 was Section 508. It creates a framework of guidelines that are based upon the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, commonly referred to as WCAG. So WCAG has a whole host of success criteria that need to be met for a product to be deemed accessible. Federal contractors and agencies and vendors can only supply the federal government with accessible IT solutions. Those accessible IT solutions, when forward-facing or internally facing, internal or externally facing, that they have to be accessible to employees and to constituents, anyone who's looking at federal websites. To change gears a little, Maryland's non-visual access clause is in fact based on Section 508 and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Entire sections of of the law was and standards were adopted or fully adopted or adopted with and paraphrased. There's quite a bit of crossover. Maryland's non-visual access clause is in line with Section 508 and WCAG 2.0 AA success criteria. So for those that were just curious about that. So sometimes we get to, we are asked, posed questions, say, is Maryland's visual accessibility laws are tougher than the federal government? I'm like, no, it's sometimes a bit of a misunderstanding. In fact, it's more in line, and it's obviously based on really good law that's already out there, and definitely not to forget, American with Disabilities Act Title II impacts state and local government, and obviously state and local government service, including websites, obviously need to be accessible. So here in Maryland, we have a few different laws active that, that we try to make sure that we abide by and make sure that our IT solutions are accessible for all Marylanders and constituents. So as I prefaced earlier, the web content accessibility guidelines, these are ISO standards, so the internationally accepted standards. They were developed by the W3C, World Wide Web Consortium. And this is a really interesting group of, you've got government, local, federal, state, from around the world, and you got tech people, you got advocates, you got attorneys, you got lawyers, you got procurement folks. You got a really massive, wide range of folks that are involved in W3C, which is great. It's a mixture of a paid and a volunteer organization, and these guys really make sure they do a really good job of developing these web content accessibility guidelines, and they're constantly working on the latest version. Right now, there's going between I believe it's WCAG 2.2 and 3.0. That they're constantly moving the target and trying to make sure the accessibility laws, or should say accessibility guidelines, are more and more encompassing of new technologies. And the reason why this happens ultimately is the actual federal standards. So when we think of the guidelines that the feds follow, and the state of Maryland follows, is 2.0 and AA. There's obviously benefits of the next generation, which was 2.1. 2.1 includes mobile devices as well. So that's why I think eventually the federal government will eventually get over to using 2.1, just because there's so much use of mobile devices now in our society, especially with COVID and people working on the go. I think that's pretty in the past, people didn't have smartphones, and now wherever you are, you have access to the internet, and you have access to email and social media and whatnot. So why is all this accessibility stuff important? Well, here in Maryland, we're fortunate to be home to some really good advocacy organizations, such as the National Federation of the Blind and Surrounding Areas, National Association of the Deaf. And it's great to, we definitely try to partner and work with these different advocacy organizations. They are obviously advocating for constituents with disabilities, and the same fashion the Maryland Department of Disabilities, we're also obviously here to support and promote inclusion and obviously promote accessibility for individuals with disabilities. The stat there is roughly about 22% of our population here has a disability. So obviously, Maryland, we have the accessibility law in place. We have this accessibility team in place, and we have lots of really motivated leaders within the state that really want to push accessibility forward, and that's something that's very I find very exciting as well. And finally, obviously, as much as we're constantly trying to improve access and ensure that everybody's included, and good IT solutions, good UX experience, user experience, and being accessible. These benefit everybody, not just people with disabilities, people without disabilities too. So continuing on, why accessibility is important, and we have two routes: designed accessibility and the remediation model. Obviously, I definitely prefer the designed accessible route, and John prefaced it earlier, and about having products being accessible from inception and design. That's definitely the way to go. It is far easier to make a product accessible as you're building it out, versus adding and using the remediation model of, you create an IT solution and then you try to remediate it to make it accessible at the end of the development cycle. That is usually an ineffective, expensive, and problematic way to go. Here at the state of Maryland, we prefer the other route, which is creating, as we're creating an accessibility solution, IT solutions, is interweaving accessibility as the product has been built out. I'm very fortunate that that the team that I work, that I'm part of, we get to work with various state entities as they're building out IT solutions, and we get to test them as as it's going through the dev cycle. We've had fantastic collaboration with the Department of IT here in Maryland. They're obviously very strong partners with us, and they care deeply about accessibility. You can see that every day, and all of the efforts they do to make sure that they're constantly looking to improve their digital footprint. So we've got great partners there. Accessibility is definitely not like a one and done, that remediation model where we look and say we'll fix it up and yeah, it's done, it's good to go, you can tie a bow on it. Accessibility is one of those things that you need to keep an eye on. Like, even if you start from the inception and design as you wireframe and build out an IT solution, once that solution goes live, anytime there's an update or new content added, it's possible that accessible IT solution becomes somewhat less accessible. So that's important to constantly monitor IT solutions that we put out there in the public space. So we have quite an interesting topic here, is overlays and accessible plugins. So there's a big movement right now happening in the US over the last year, and it's ultimately, there's a lot of resistance and negative press about the use of an accessibility overlay, which is usually it's a piece of code that's injected into a website or an IT solution to attempt to make that IT solution accessible. It became very popular. There were companies were selling lots of these plugins that would make make websites accessible, for example. Ultimately, these accessible overlays, and I want to using the word accessible with air quotes around it, they tend to be actually quite problematic. Like, the intention is good, no doubt, but the implementation and the user experience for individuals, especially those who are blind and relying on non-visual access, these accessible overlays are like super problematic. So we definitely don't really encourage the use of these accessible overlays unless it was in some type of workaround manner where they were temporarily using an overlay as a stopgap to make a website accessible. But that's something that we're not it's something that we're not doing here at the state. We're not encouraging any agencies to purchase these accessible plugins or overlays, which are actually steering folks away from that and definitely sticking with the model of accessible by design. Can a third party provide that temporary solution? I just mentioned it. Yeah, a third party IT solution such as an accessible overlay plugin could be a temporary stopgap. If you're, say, your agency or wherever you work. I know there's people outside of the state on this call. So if you guys were, if someone outside of the state was launching a website and the website came to be, and then it was noted that the website has some significant issues, and you had the option of temporarily, for a few weeks or a few months, using an accessible overlay to help the issue as a workaround temporarily. I mean, that might be okay, but it would definitely be something that should be really just done on a real temporary basis with a firm remediation plan in place to get the original IT solution accessible. So Maryland's current state, as I prefaced earlier, we work very closely with the Department of IT. We have a fantastic partnership with these guys. We've worked quite a bit testing their latest version of their templates to ensure that the state websites that go live are accessible. The new template has constantly been worked on and improved for accessibility, and just that kind of hand in hand real collegial, high level coordination is really, the state's managed to put out a really good product, and it's, we're very pleased about how the template has developed. We also work with MDOD also works with DGS and IT as we're working on creating compliance checks and acting as consultants during the procurement process. And then we're also doing a lot of work around education. I know John prefaced it earlier. Education and training is a very key and important way that the state is building capacity. We definitely are trying to make sure that procurement staff receive training on Maryland's non-visual access clause and training on, basic accessibility, what it's about, why it's important, and trying to build that capacity like across the state. So we're doing lots of good work there as well. We're also obviously continuing to support agencies with testing and education. Lots of good work, especially around education, and again, building capacity has been a really big push for us. The next slide is the technical training, coding, design, and practice section.
And that would be my section. Hello, everyone. Thank you all. And before we get into this part of the presentation, I just want to make a couple quick comments just so people are aware of how we're going to handle this. This section is kind of all about the technical techniques for making a website compliant. However, these things can apply to other things. So while any of you who are developers or content managers or website managers, you're probably going to get the most out of this section, I do encourage everyone to stay and listen to this, because these are the kind of things you're also going to want to be aware of in cases like procurement and such. Like, if you're procuring a product and you ask, oh, well, does this product have, alt text for any images or whatever? And your vendor says, what's alt text? That's a major red flag. So, this kind of will give you a leg up on figuring out what is accessible, what is needed at least, and what, even if you don't ever use any of these technical techniques, you'll be aware of what is needed for a particular disability to address these things. We will be taking questions during this section. I would ask that you send them directly to Lori Markland, our moderator. You can use Q&A, you can use chat, you can raise your hand. We'll try and address them at the end of each slide. If we don't, we'll try and get to them during the break. There'll be a break close to the end of this section. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So Andrew talked about the WCAG earlier, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We're going to be mostly focusing on the WCAG 2.0 AA standards, because both the Non-Visual Access Clause and Section 508 directly reference them. They're kind of our baseline, our solutions to these criteria. Those guidelines are based on 4 principles. First is perceivable, so presenting information in UI in multiple formats, so that if someone can't use a particular, or can't get information because they're lacking a particular sense, they're able to get that information in another manner. Operable, all elements should be usable by all users. Primarily, that's involving that you can use the keyboard to navigate everything in the product or in the website. That does occasionally stretch out into other areas, though, making sure that parts of the site are accessible to assistive technology such as screen readers. Understandable is our third principle, where all UI and content should behave consistently. Once you've set up expectations of how something works on your site, it should work that way across the whole board. links and buttons should act as such. You shouldn't code a button to work as something else using different technique or ARIA or something like that. You want to make sure that everything is behaving the same way. That's especially important with forms. If you click a button and something appears on screen, you want to make sure people are aware of that. And then finally, robust, where content and UI should work with assistive technology. It's kind of a bit of a catch-all because it's talking about, it really only has 2 guidelines here, and at least in the 2.0 standards, but both of them are essentially saying that every element has to be able to work with assistive technology. Some elements, especially if you're using anything custom, might have trouble with that, so you need to put in the building blocks that screen readers and like voice recognition software like Dragon use in order to allow these users to work with those parts. I do encourage you, if you are a web developer or a content manager for your agency's website, go take a look at the WCAG 2.0 standards. You might already have, in which case, awesome, because I'm not going to cover all of them. However, there are direct references and links in the handout that came out to you guys earlier. If you didn't get it for whatever reason, don't worry, we'll send it out again in the follow-up email after the presentation. But you can use that handout to go to the specific solutions for those issues we talk about in the handout. So what are the common things that we encounter typically when we're testing a website? These we found across everything, and they're not specific to websites. Some of them are particular to apps or other IT solutions. So kind of everything we're talking about here applies to, in general, to any concern about accessibility. So first off is alt text on images. You'll hear about this pretty much in anything on accessibility. Mostly we're focusing though, because people across the state have been pretty good actually about having alt text, but there are some best practices that and nuances in how to do it that we want to make sure people are aware of. Headings and navigational landmarks. It's one of the main things keyboard only users and screen reader users use in order to get around a website. So making sure that we have a good structure for them to use to get around the site efficiently. Links, making sure that they have descriptions and accessible names so that a user knows exactly where they're going to be going when they click that link. Forms, making sure that there's labels, that people understand exactly what they're filling in, and that any error validation that occurs actually tells people what they need to fix and where it is. And then we'll talk a little bit about ARIA, which is a set of definitions and attributes that can help make websites and content more accessible. A lot of the times we see people overusing them or using them in the wrong place, so we want to try and address that. Then we'll talk a bit about work processes when we get into content updates and making sure that as you're adding new content to your website or taking off old content, that you're making sure that you're cleaning it up or adding in those last little things to make sure that you have what is needed to be accessible. Like, say you're posting a video. Well, did you remember to put in captioning? Okay, great. Go ahead. That kind of thing. We'll talk a little bit about web apps, just what some cases, what you need in order to either make those work, or if you need to offer an alternative for that information that's available. Because in the case of like a map widget where it's primarily visual information and we're trying to do what we can to make those accessible, but making sure that people have, if that's giving directions to where your agency is, that we have those directions in a text format so that someone who can't operate that map widget or just needs to copy paste it or whatever can get to it. And then finally, just some older code practices that they're not harmful, but if we can stop doing them, that would be excellent, such as the use of the break tag, because it can be an annoyance over time for users. Let's start with image alt text. So the best practices for this, the things to keep in mind when you're writing it, is you want it to be concise and you want to explain the purpose and the subject. Why is this image here? Why do I care that it's there? What is this giving me? So think about when you're adding an image to your website, or if you're looking over content that's been given to you to post or something. What is this image supposed to represent? Is it telling me, who this person is? If it's about a person, is it about a particular action that's happening? Someone, walking down or walking into the new agency building or something. That's all you need to state. You don't need to go into all this detail of what the picture looks like and who's in it and such. You only need to get across, why is this relevant to the consumer. Graphic links, if you're using the image as a link, you want to make sure that instead of putting something like a description, you instead state, where is this link going? The reason for that is because assistive technology is going to use that alt text instead of any other text around in the link, or the title or whatever. So having that alt text state where you're going is absolutely necessary. If you're just using an image to fill space or to draw people's eyes to a section or something, in those cases, then you actually don't want assistive technology users or screen reader users to have to filter through that, because it doesn't give them any extra information. So in those cases, you actually want to use an empty alt attribute, which is better known as null, or a null alt attribute. What that does is that causes the screen reader to skip over it. Now, you still need to make sure that the alt attribute is there. If it's not, then the screen reader will say there's an image here with no description. So make sure that you don't just upload the image and leave it. It's not going to default to that. Some other best practices you should keep in mind. If you have any text in the image, it should be in the alt text. Unless you have that text elsewhere, like in a paragraph below or above the image. In that case, you don't need it. But if you're doing something like call this number now or something, you need to have that in the alt text, because that information needs to get to the user if they can't see it or read it. Don't use photo of or graphic of. Assistive technologies will do that for you. So that saves you a couple words and saves you, that extra second of writing. And then it just adds, extra repetition for users. So I'm trying to avoid doing that. Logos should be stated as company, or as the company or agency logo. Like in the case of ours at the start of the presentation, since we know who we're presenting as, or you've seen like all the various emails coming from us and such, we can just put those as MDOD logo or MD tap logo. Now, if this was coming to you brand new or something, or it's a new contact or whatever, you might want to put the full name instead, Maryland Department of Disabilities or Maryland Technology Assistance Program, and then logo. The important thing though is that users understand that this is your branding. They don't need to know the details of exactly what that logo looks like, especially because they can get complicated. Logos have a couple exemptions in the WCAG guidelines because of this, so it's more important that users understand this has our official branding on it, and this means that this is representative of us. Now, if you're dealing with something like a chart or a graph, something complex, in those cases we actually have to kind of break it out a bit, because you can't fit all of that information in the alt text of that image, especially because users, when they focus that image, they have to hear the alt text in one go. If they stop it, they have to go back and refocus it in order to hear it again. So you really just want to give them the title or the summary of the chart or graph or infographic. Give them, what is this, what information is this presenting? And then you want to provide a breakdown or all of the other information inside that, chart or infographic through other means, preferably text. There is an example in the handout that can help you guys. That one is particular, or that one gives a link underneath the image that you would click and would open a dialog box in and give a text description of the chart. It's a very simplified one. Please don't take that code and try and plug it in somewhere. It will not work. But it should give you enough of an idea of how that should work that you can adapt that and finish the JavaScript function, and it should work. There are other ways to do it though. The links in there will send you to a W3C website that gives you other solutions. There's the long description attribute, which mostly works, but honestly, providing it in another method, usually a link to another page or something like a dialog box, or even just having a text description below it, is usually better practice. Now, headings and landmarks. There's two levels to this. Now, 2.4.6, which is the WCAG guideline specific to this, AA, this is the required one. So this is the one that's both Section 508 and Maryland NVA Clause .2, that headings should be sufficiently descriptive. That has to happen. So if you have a heading on your website or something, it needs to be descriptive of what's following it. What is this drawing attention to? In practice, that almost never comes up, but it is something to be aware of, that if you're putting in a heading, why are you putting in that heading? The AAA standard 2.4.10, where it says sections of the site should start with headings, I point to this a lot, and I heavily suggest this because the blind people I've worked with before have said this is the main method we get around a website with. So making sure you have that navigational structure in your website is pretty critical towards making your site more accessible to blind users, but to other users who are only relying on the keyboard or assistive technology that lets them use shortcuts like that. So having that heading structure where you have essentially kind of an outline, where you have, in the best practice, we tell you here, use an H1 to start your main content block, and then you shouldn't skip levels. So the way it works, and there's an example again in the handout, where you have the H1 starting your main content, and you have H2, level 2 headings, starting each of your main sections, lets a user immediately jump down to, with like 3 key presses, get down to like the news and update section of your website. Or, I'm looking for how to sign up for, or I'm looking for this particular form to fill out for this agency, and it's under this quick links heading. So I can press H2 a couple times, I'm at quick links, and then I can go down through that list in order to find that link faster than if I had to go through everything else on the website. And then you can use H3, H4, H5, H6 to break it down further, depending on how much content you have there. We do recommend that you kind of avoid using headings just to draw attention to stuff, because the headings kind of have that expectation, that semantic meaning of this is starting a section underneath it. And that's why we also say don't skip levels, because if you go H1 to H3, but then there's an H2 later on after that, that's going to cause the user either to miss that section, that H3, because they're moving through only the specific levels of headings, or it's going to cause some confusion when you've jumped to H2, but then you press H3 and you jump back before that H2. So making sure that we don't cause additional confusion with that navigation. One other thing you can also do to help with this is you can add HTML5 landmarks tags. So those are like header and footer and main. You can add those to areas for identification. Those actually now provide those landmarks for users to use so that they can get to the footer of your website faster. They also work as divs, so you don't have to put another div in there after it. The header will act as a div for this, or the nav tag will act as a navigation menu and a div, so you can put things in there and you can apply CSS to it, you can apply JavaScript to it, and you shouldn't have any issues with it. Those should be used in addition to. The reason for that is because like the main tag kind of just takes over the whole main area of your page. It doesn't really break into sections more, so that's where headings would come more into play, but it gives just another way for users to get around the site faster. Just gonna check. Nope, doing good on questions. Okay, so links. Description. Oops, didn't mean to do that. There we go.
Stephen, it's
Oh,
Lori.
yep.
I do have one quick question that popped in.
Sure.
It says, can you only use H1 one time?
The best practice is to try and use H1 once per page. Yes. You can in some cases where like your page is divided into multiple areas, or if you have like for whatever reason you have a very, very long page, which the web developers are going to tell you that's bad practice because that's going to take longer to load and such. But if for whatever reason you do that, you can get away with it, but it's not recommended. We're not going to tell you no, because you can do whatever you want, but yeah, it is best practice to only use a single H1 per page. I should also state, based on that, if you have like a quick nav menu or a sub nav menu, like in a sidebar or something, that can start with an H2 and your main content can start with the H1 after it. That's perfectly fine to do that H2 then H1, because even if in the DOM order or document object model order, which we'll get to later, they'll hit that heading first. The idea is the H1 is, this is what this web page is all about. Go here first. The reason for that is that it gives users a way to skip all that other information above it too. The skip to main content links, which come up, that is something that is also used to bypass like that navigation menu and bar and such, but H1 is also another way to do it. So that's why WCAG recommends using just a single one. Thank you. Okay, so links. First off, we need to describe them for the user. They need to understand what they're clicking and what it's going to do. We don't want to surprise them with, oh, now you're over here, or oh, we've loaded a new section of the website that I wasn't going to use. We don't want people clicking on things because they need to understand what it does. There are, again, 2 levels to this. This comes up a lot with the standards. What is compliant according to law is a link in programmatic context. So what that means is we have click here for registration. Click here is the link, but the entire phrase is in a paragraph tag. So when a user moves through that paragraph, they will hear link, click here, click here, link for registration. Now, if they are just moving through links, they'll only hear click here, but they have context information that is programmatically associated that if they're moving through content, they will hear the whole thing. That's enough. However, the AAA standard, which is really easy to hit, so we kind of encourage people to work with this, is the link alone should have enough context. So making the entire phrase, click here for registration, the link, it gives people enough information that if they're just moving through links, they know what every single one of those does. Most of the time, this is just really easy to do with just the link text itself. However, there are times when we need to put what is called an accessible name on it. So what this is a term for identification of an element. Other kinds of elements will also have accessible names, quote unquote. But for links, what this is doing is usually providing additional information. Typically, you're using either the title attribute or the ARIA label attribute. And both of those don't add any additional visual information, but they read out through screen readers or other assistive technology instead. Title provides extra information. ARIA label will instead overwrite what else is there, including the link text, and tell users what this is based on that. So keep in mind that if you're using title, that reads in addition to, so you don't want to just repeat link text in there. One good way to use this sometimes actually is if you make like an acronym a link, you might want to spell out the full name in the title or something. Mostly just actually for pronunciation's sake, because screen readers notoriously struggle with acronyms. A lot of the times they try and make a word out of it. So sometimes it's just easier to give people the full name instead. Another thing with links to make sure that you're aware of is identification. Making sure that you're not just using color for identifying it, that there are other ways to determine it from text and such. The default underlining is kind of your best way to do that. If for whatever reason you're stylizing it to look differently, you want to make sure that people can still understand this is separate text that will actually function if you interact with it. Either having an effect that happens when you focus on it or move through it, or having shadow underneath it, or some other kind of indication aside from color that this is an interactive element. Form labels. So this is where we start getting into kind of more of the complex stuff, where it making this function might be a little bit more challenging. I do want to mention here that if you're using SharePoint, do it. Web services will handle forms for you, so you can leave this up to them. But you should still kind of be aware of these things because it's useful to at least double check, hey, is this actually here? And stuff. I think my bar just popped up again. If you put the title of the document for the link, is that sufficient? Yes, it is, because the what you're doing is telling people this link will give you this document. You know, and if it's like a PDF or something, the assistive technology will usually tell the user this is leading not to a web page, this is leading to like a PDF or a document or whatever. So just telling people what this, this title or what the title of the document is usually enough. Okay, give me a second. Apologies. All right, so back to form labels. So basic requirement is that all fields need to have some method of labeling. When a user goes to that field, they need to hear or see what they're supposed to be doing with it. For screen readers, they prioritize, they have a priority list of which labels they're going to read. Anything that is ARIA, such as ARIA label or ARIA labeled by, overwrites everything else. So that's kind of one of the dangers of ARIA. That's why we really recommend using native elements. But if you're working in like a web application or like a mobile app, in those cases you don't have HTML, so you're using ARIA to accomplish the same thing. But be aware of the fact that if your form has ARIA label or ARIA labeled by in there, it's going to overwrite. Next would be the HTML tag label, which is kind of your best choice. Most native elements are the most commonly supported, and they have the least likely chance to not work. So it's kind of our best method. Label has a couple ways you can use it. They're written in, you can see the examples in the handout I provided, or we provided earlier. A label, you can either use the for attribute in order to point it at input's ID, or you can just wrap it around the whole text and input tag, and it'll just automatically associate everything inside of it with that. You have a title attribute, which again, be aware that it is providing additional information. So, and it also doesn't provide you a visual label. So if you're using the title attribute on an input, you still need to have like a span or a paragraph tag next to the field that provides, you know, a text instruction as to what to put there. And then finally, the placeholder attribute, which is the least recommended option here, because once a user starts putting in data into that field, the placeholder is wiped. So if they, for whatever reason, come back to it or whatever, they've now lost the label for that field, and they might not remember what to do with it. So placeholders, they are useful for providing examples, but don't rely on them for labeling your form fields. And then your labels need to be clear and descriptive. What exactly do you need here? If you can provide instruction, if there's like a particular format for like a date that you want, you need to make sure that that is available in some manner to your users. I went into it a little bit on the last slide, but here are the differences between the types of label. There's the HTML tag, which, as I mentioned, you can either wrap it around both the text that you want and the actual input itself, or you can use the for attribute. Just make sure it's using the exact ID for the input that it is supposed to be labeling. Those need to match perfectly. If they don't, it won't function. ARIA label, which is it's not visible. It doesn't provide it doesn't provide a visible input on or text or whatever. It is an attribute that you just put on the input. So it's kind of like title in that it functions inside the input itself. It will overwrite anything else. So it's really kind of more useful if for whatever reason you can't like edit the text or whatever around the form field. You can still put this on, and people will still have some kind of programmatic label that they can hear or read with their AT. ARIA labeled by kind of functions the same way as label, in that it's just kind of more in the reverse. ARIA labeled by is an attribute you can put on the input, but it will point at the ID of something else and read that other element as a description of what it is placed on. So like I said, it's kind of the reverse of label, where as long as you have the matching IDs, it will use the other element as the label or description of what it is placed on. So you can use like a span or a paragraph tag in those cases. Just make sure it has a unique ID. You can also use multiple elements with this attribute. However, be aware that it's just going to read through all of those, so you don't want to overwhelm users. So try to keep it to one, maybe two, if you are using it for error validation as well. Title attribute, as I said, that is on the input. It also will appear as a tooltip. When you hover over it, it'll show up. It'll read to users, but it reads in addition to other labels. So it's primarily used more to provide extra information than it is to provide an actual name to something. And then finally, placeholder is what shows that text inside the input. again, usually providing examples. If you're doing a date, you might have, month slash day slash year. I said 5 years there. I apologize. 4 years. You know what I mean. So again, once you start writing in that input, though, the placeholder's gone. So don't rely on it for labeling. Just rely it for providing that example of how to fill it in. That also will come up when we get to error validation, because we want to make sure that any error messages are coming to us explain, if we messed up the formatting, that we put it in the right formatting, and that we are telling users this is what's supposed to be. One other type of label I want to point out is called group labeling. So this is really useful for if you're either breaking your form into sections, or if you have something like a set of radio buttons, or like a group selection, and making sure that people understand or put the question with the individual answers. So this is defined by the tag field set. So field set kind of wrap around that whole section and treats it as a single part. And then legend kind of applies a group label. So if you put, like, the example here has, just a couple inputs for first name and last name, where we have the form tag wrapping around the whole thing. Then we have field set for this section. We have legend for personal information. And then we have label for the first name input. We have input for the first name. Then we have label for the last name. Then input for the last name. And then we have a submit button. Another way, if we're looking at like a radio button or something, is we'd have the question in the legend, and then we'd have the different inputs for, yes, no, or maybe, or whatever, and each of those would have their own label. So that way, when a user is moving to those radio buttons, they'll hear the question, but then they'll hear the label for the actual radio button, and then if they move to the next radio button, they'll only hear that label, but if they come back in or out, they'll hear the question along with it, just so they don't have to double back to the question itself. I should also point out that something like the input type submit, you don't actually have to have a label for that, because the value kind of functions as that. It's treated more as a button or something, so it uses its value as the label itself. That's specific only to the type submit, though. It won't work. That won't work if you're using like a different kind of input type as your submission button. That really only applies in cases where you're using a form developed with JavaScript or something, but just in case, you need to know. So error validation. I'm kind of just going to give the broad strokes of this, because it can get complicated the more complex your form is and such. There are some simple examples in that handout, but the key things to keep in mind is any errors that are detected, they have to be identified in text. There has to be, you can't just highlight it in red. There has to be something saying, this field has an error, or there's a list at the start of the form saying, these particular items need to be fixed. So making sure that you have those messages in text that can be focused in red. Any required fields need to be programmatically identified. That's easy to do. There's just the HTML or ARIA. They both have attributes you can just put on the input that say a user will tell them is required. It's just important that they understand that, rather than just using like the convention for the star next to the label to say that this is required. The reason for that is because AT will go to that field and say required on it, so that users will understand, okay, this is one of the required fields. I don't have to rely on the label just reading star at me. Any suggestions or error corrections need to have programmatic feedback. what that means is if you're giving any suggestions, like after they leave a field and move to the next one or something, if like, you get that invalid entry or, error message saying, this date must be in this format, that needs to either read aloud to the user if they're using a screen reader, or it needs to give an alert, or, there has to be something there that draws the user's attention back to it. If that message just pops up in text with, with just, red color or whatever, user who is blind isn't going to hear that. They're not going to know they have to go back and fix that. So making sure that users have that feedback so that they are able to go and make these corrections before they submit. And the final point is any legal, financial, or other user controllable data needs to have a review step or confirmation before action is taken. That's kind of become a normal convention of these things, but just again, be aware that when a user is going through a form, there needs to be that, check all your information before you click submit. Or after clicking submit, there needs to be like a secondary confirmation, something like that, so that users are consciously making this choice and they don't accidentally send in information that's either incomplete or is wrong or whatever. Some simple methods for addressing these problems. The handout goes into more detail, but to summarize, any errors that one of the easiest ways to handle like error messages or error suggestions, like corrections, is to put a notice at the start of the form, after either reload the page, or if like you're working inside like a PHP document or whatever, that focus moves back to the top of the form where that message is, and it lists out, the date has to be in this format, or this address field needs to be filled in. Making sure that users have those specific messages so that they know what exactly they have to do in order to either make that field work or that they missed this field and need to fill it in. Again, indicate those required fields. You can either use the HTML required attribute, or if you're not working with HTML, you can use ARIA required to achieve the same thing, or ARIA required equals true, sorry. Making sure that you use either one of those in order for users to understand that their assistive technology tells them this field is required. Provide that review step with those multi-page forms that has all the completed steps available for checking. The users can move through that, read through everything, and they can edit it there as well. And then make sure that there's feedback after a form has been submitted so the user understands, okay, this went through, I'm done. Having that thank you message at the end or something. Okay. I think we're still good on time for right now. Yeah, so I'm gonna get through the last few bits of this and we'll get to our break. So hang on tight, everyone. So why ARIA? So ARIA is, or author-rich internet applications. So this is a set of definitions and attributes that is intended to be used to help make digital content work with assistive technology. It's used primarily to assign names, roles, and values to content that doesn't have native support. So like we said, you want to make sure that if you're working on a website or something, you're using HTML before you use ARIA. Always ask yourself, why are you using ARIA? So this is more likely to be used by developers than content managers. It's very uncommon that you'll need to use it. But the reason it's in this presentation today is because it is present on like the Do It template. It's present on other state sites. So we want to make sure that you are aware of what it does and why it's there. So the most common types you're going to see, first off, is role. Role is kind of the primary thing of ARIA, or the primary attribute, because it essentially tells browsers, assistive technology, and other such what this element is or does. So like if you put the role equals button on like a link or something, assistive technology is going to look at that link and instead say, this is a button, and will tell the user that. And then there's a lot of different roles, but the important thing is that you're aware of this changes the behavior of something. ARIA label, ARIA labeled by, and ARIA described by. We've talked about these before. They provide accessible names or descriptions for content. ARIA described by works exactly the same as ARIA labeled by, using a referenced ID to essentially pull content to read it for something else. It is kind of just that semantic description or difference, that semantic difference between the two. ARIA labeled by is providing a label, whereas ARIA described by is providing that other information. Described by can also be used a lot with error messages and such, and it'll be added in with JavaScript to announce to users or tell users, there's an error message here and this is what it is. ARIA selected and ARIA expanded, you'll see these on state websites a lot when they're using those tabs or collapsible sections. That's really useful for screen readers because it tells them this is open or closed. And when they activate it, they'll actually hear that change so that they'll know, okay, I've pressed this tab for this FAQ question, and it'll tell them this section is opened up and you can now access it. So those you'll commonly see, and they are very useful for that. And then ARIA required and ARIA invalid. As I mentioned before, those are used in forms, or ARIA required is in order to tell the user this is a required field. ARIA invalid is usually added in via JavaScript, or tell them this was an invalid answer and you need to fix this. Okay. Sorry, just the little screen comes down for chat, and I was just checking to make sure there wasn't a question. I can't help myself sometimes. Okay, best practices with ARIA. Just things to be again aware of, depending on how in depth you want to get with this. I will tell you we do have a presentation coming up in May where we go into a lot more depth with ARIA. I will be joined by Carl Bellinger from the NFB. We'll be discussing what ARIA does, some other various uses of it, but here's kind of your main rules to be aware of if you're going to mess with ARIA whatsoever. First off, again, always use those native elements first if possible. ARIA has some complications with it. It is fairly well supported, but it does override other behaviors. So if you start adding too many, it's going to cause issues or confusion, or you're going to cause something to not work the way you actually wanted it to. That comes up a lot when people start using like the role equals menu or role equals application. So if you can do it with HTML, stick to HTML. ARIA is more intended for if you're working with like XML, or if you're working with a widget that's using a different kind of programming language. I think you might be able to use it with PHP. I'm not 100% sure on that, but those are when ARIA might be useful to you. Roles should be assigned in order to match other HTML elements. So like if you are putting the role equals heading on there, you want to make sure that you also add the level equals 2, to match essentially a heading level 2. Role by itself will assign the behavior, but there's also other parts to it. So if you're using ARIA in order to essentially mimic an HTML element, you're going to have to look up the other parts of that too in order to make it fully behave like that. Again, be aware that ARIA almost always overrides HTML attributes. There are a few specified exceptions, but those are kind of those are only used in very specific scenarios. So in most cases, you're going to find that ARIA is taking over. And then finally, ARIA is not a standalone language. You can't use it on its own. It has to be an attribute on something else, either on HTML or on XML or whatever language you are working with at the time.
Hey, Stephen.
Yes.
Sorry again. We have another question that popped up.
Great.
What is an example of a native element?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. So a native element is, in most cases, it's the default language you're using. So on a website, that's HTML. So a native element would be something like that H2, where if we want to replicate that with ARIA, we would have to use both role equals heading and level equals 2. If you have the HTML attribute or the HTML tag image or IMG, the ARIA equivalent of that is role equals IMG. So native elements refers to any of those HTML tags that you're using. I hope that was sufficient. Is that it, question-wise?
That's it so far.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. 10:52. All right, give it another 5 minutes. So now this next part is more where we start talking a little bit about work processes and such. If you guys have any questions about any of the technical parts or any techniques, or if you just want to confirm that something is a sufficient match, please feel free to contact me. We'll be giving our contact information at the end of the presentation. You also should have it already from the initial email burst, but I am always willing to help people with these kind of things. So if you have any other questions or want to go more in depth about the technical solutions, please let me know. All right, so content updating. So this is for when you are looking to put new content on your website or you're removing old content, make sure that you're being careful if you're doing any copy pasting. A lot of the times, either when you copy something from somewhere else, it's going to bring code with it, and that might also bring any like title attributes or other parts that you're using, or elements that are there that are invisible because they don't have, like, there's a link that doesn't have any actual text inside the link. The link's still there programmatically, and a screen reader user is going to find it. So being aware of that those are still there. We see that a lot when people are using a content management system, a CMS, where they're moving the text around or something, but you might need to still double check that HTML, because if you delete the text, it might not always delete the link. Or if you're putting in new content, but you don't want people accessing it initially, so you just leave it visually hidden, making sure that there is something else there to keep screen reader users from finding it, like ARIA equals hidden or a null alt attribute or something like that, so that users aren't running into these things that you might not be aware of. Essentially just being aware of that. If you're doing any copy pasting, there's usually some invisible code or background code that's coming along with that. So making sure just double check that and such. Use to template formatting. Most content management systems, we'll be talking about SharePoint, which is the one that Do It uses. We'll be talking about it later in the presentation, but whatever you're using, making sure you're using those template formats. Is usually like a ribbon bar at the top that has like, heading formatting or paragraph formatting or what have you. You need to make sure that you use those because those put in those tags. If you just put in text and then style it to look like a heading, it's not going to function as a heading. So you want to make sure that you have that code back there. You don't actually have to do the code. The system will do that for you, but you need to make sure that you're using the button that enables that. Make sure that you have a step in your work process that accounts for accessibility. If you're doing any content creation or content preparation for like a video for Twitter or something, you want to make sure that you have captioning. So making sure that when you put in that request for that video, or whoever is giving you that video also gives you something to use as captions. Most common is an SRT file. Twitter takes that for upload. Facebook, YouTube, all of those take that. It's the most commonly used. There are other types as well used for captioning, but you'll need something. Or they can just add the captions to the video itself. That's known as open captioning, where it's just available for everyone at all times and there's no way to turn it off. Making sure that we've at least thought to and added that to our process, because if you yourself don't have a disability or you're not regularly working with those with disabilities, you might not be used to thinking about these things as you're just going through your day. So you need to make sure that your work process has at least a step for double checking. Okay, I have this news story I need to publish on my site. Does my image have alt text? Does any links I have, are they descriptive enough? Making sure that when you upload it and you've added it in, that top title of that news story is actually a heading so that users can use it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, making sure that when you're removing that old content that's no longer needed, make sure to just double check that any remaining code is removed as well, like that empty link tag. If you delete the text, the link tag still might be there and the screen reader user is still going to find it because the screen reader is still moving around. It might not tell them what that is, but they'll still notice it because the code is still there. And if you're doing anything with content that you're visually hiding it, be aware that that is not always hidden from screen readers depending on how you're doing that. If you're using something like CSS visibility, making sure you're using hidden, or if you're saying like display, you need to use display none in order to remove it, that kind of thing. If you're just deleting like the text inside or something, that doesn't actually remove the code and users can still find that.
Hey, Stephen, it's Lori. We have another question that popped in.
Great.
It's kind of a question slash suggestion.
Okay.
Do you have a site that has real pages marked up using all of the things you have presented today? It would be extremely helpful to have an actual page that state agencies can refer to for guidance. If not, could you create one for agencies to refer to? A site like this would be a compliment or a great compliment to this webinar.
Okay. That is something we can definitely take into consideration. At this time, we don't, because a lot of what we've done, because so many other people have done these things already that didn't really want to reinvent the wheel. So instead, we provide these links to other things like the W3C, which already has all these techniques and best practices laid out for you. The handout has each of those links for each of those sections, like image alt text or form validation. But we can look into creating like an example web page or something that displays all of this for you. That will take some time, but that should be achievable, yeah. Where am I? Okay. I want to talk a little quickly about web apps before our break. The main thing to keep in mind, most of the time, if you're dealing with web apps, you're probably getting them from a vendor or something. There's a lot of different ways you can create these, so I'm not going to go at all into detail of the code behind it, but the kind of golden rule for dealing with web apps or widgets or whatever is aim for accessibility, but have accommodations ready. The more complex or visually based the system is, the more there is a need to have that information available in another format, text in particular. One of the best examples I can give for this is something like one of the GIS widgets or the Esri map widgets. The map itself can be somewhat or it can be very challenging to use with this screen reader. Parts of it are accessible, other parts are not. But one of the things it does great is that any data that it's showing, it has in a separate table format. And that table is accessible and can be downloaded. And that gives like a screen reader user or something a way to get that information and use it efficiently without having to struggle with the widget itself. Something like Google Maps, where you have the directions listed out in text that's separate from the map region. That, again, is a way to deal with that. If you are using it separately, if you're putting up like a data set or something that you're displaying in like a series of like interactive tables, or like you click a button and something reappears or something have you, sometimes you need to have that information available in another manner, either a PDF that can be downloaded or some other way, or like, you know, a video that reads through it. Just something else might be necessary to have and be aware of. You might need to develop that as you're getting this widget developed for you. Widgets are primarily governed by the WCAG guideline 4.1.2, which is name, role, and value. That is kind of where ARIA shines, is because the app has to have a programmatically discernible interface that works with assistive technology. ARIA gives you the ability to do that, but making sure that a developer you're working with is keeping in mind that, you know, these interface elements like buttons or like a search field or whatever have ways in order to communicate to a screen reader, okay, this is supposed to act like this and should have this expected behavior. And when a user gets to it, they'll know, okay, this is the search field, I need to input something here. And make sure to communicate all these things to any contracted vendors you're working with. Everything we've talked about before with like the form labels and image alt text, all of that applies to widgets. They just might need to do or accomplish those things in a different manner, but they need to be aware of the fact that our laws state you need these things. Okay, before I get into this part, we are at 11:05, so Andrew, are we good with taking a break here before we jump back into it, or do you want me to try and get through the last few slides quick?
I was just thinking, let's get through the last couple of slides and we can take a break before my section.
Okay, sounds good.
All right.
All right, thank you. With that then, some other old code practices just to be careful of, be mindful of. Try to be careful of how you put in either white space to fill in areas, or like putting like spaces in between paragraphs or something. Really want to try and avoid using HTML attributes to do that, such as the break tag or the NVSP entity, which kind of adds just a blank field there, because things like screen readers or assistive technology still interpret those, and that can cause disjointed reading for them. You know, if you have like a break tag in the middle of a paragraph in order to make sure that it splits, you know, properly visually, well, a screen reader is going to read the first part of that paragraph and then stop, and then the next input will say blank, and then the third input will read the rest of the paragraph. So, or if you have, multiple paragraph, or you have a paragraph with like 2 break tags in between in order to space them apart, they'll read the first paragraph as a whole thing, then it'll read break or blank, read blank, and then read the next paragraph. So we kind of want to avoid using those if possible. CSS is a much better way for adding those kind of margins and such. It does require a little bit of playing with, but we want to try and avoid using these things as much as possible. I know SharePoint, unfortunately, does like to use break tags automatically. There's only so much you can do about it. That's why I say just keep mindful of it. Don't try to avoid having those things in between parts that are supposed to be read. So that way, like in the middle of that paragraph, because that way, at least a user is going to hear that as a single element rather than hearing, start, stop, start, stop, start, stop. Don't use tables for formatting. That's an old website practice that's been around for a while, where because it lets you have that very easy visual presentation of things in very nice tight rows, but assistive technology, particularly screen readers, are going to interpret those differently, and they'll work differently. A screen reader has the ability to move through that table in a normal order or in a different order, because they can use the controls to move from cell to cell, which can cause problems with how they interact with things. Or in some cases, it's also just annoying because it adds a lot of extraneous information, because they'll hear cell row 3, column 4, and then the actual label or form field or whatever. They don't need to hear all that other information. It doesn't help them. It actually is going to annoy them. So if for whatever reason you want to or have to use a table for formatting purposes, add role equals presentation to the table, so that screen readers don't interpret it as a table. They'll just move through it as normal content, depending on how it's read out in the document object model order, which kind of determines reading order. In most cases nowadays, CSS is powerful enough that you shouldn't ever need to use tables. If you're using the Do It SharePoint template, you don't have to worry about that. You should have all the tools you need to avoid using that. So just do the best you can, and at least be aware of, if you won't have to do it, there are ways to kind of mitigate the problems it causes. Make sure, and then finally, just make sure everything is tagged appropriately. If you're using a content management system, this will likely not be a problem for you. If you're using any kind of other developer tools, usually they'll have something that will alert you to something not having like an end tag or a cutout tag, that /p or whatever for like at the end of a paragraph tag. There are other HTML validators out there. W3C has one that we point to a lot of the time. There's plenty out there, but making sure that just everything has a tag. Floating text that's not tagged, like if you just have text inside a div, that might not be interpreted correctly by the assistive technology. It'll still be read. You don't have to worry about that, but depending on what else is around it and such, it might not be interpreted how you want them to interpret it. It might not be read as a paragraph, or it might be lower priority for reading versus something that's in like a paragraph tag or whatever. Or it might not function, like if you wanted to actually do something, it might not be connected to like a form field, like as a label or something. So just making sure that using HTML validator and that everything has a tag surrounding it, or an appropriate tag surrounding it, I should say. Okay, final part. This is where we start talking about testing and reports. So we'll be taking our break shortly, but this is when, if you either go to us for a testing report, or if you are writing your report yourself or something, or you receive something from someone, the first step is, okay, we have this report, there are problems, how do we address it? Everything that we talk about can be fixed or can be addressed. It's always easier when it's developed accessibly, but there's almost always a solution for making it accessible after the fact. We don't like doing that because it's harder, but we can fix these things. Don't worry, it'll be fine. So during the report review, usually if you go to an outside vendor for doing this, if you talk to us for this, or if you're doing this internally, whoever's doing the evaluation, it will go over the findings and kind of explain what the issues are and where they are, where can they be found, and how they can be addressed. You can ask for an opportunity to demonstrate those line items. There are either we can make recordings of it, or they can go through, if you're going to an outside person, they can come on and show exactly where that is and why it's a problem. Talk about next steps, and then there's an opportunity for follow-up, including validation testing. All right, with that, I believe my section is over now. So, Andrew?
Hi, everyone. We're going to just take a quick 5-minute recess.
That will be 11:17 according to my clock, just so people are aware. And thank you, everyone. If you do have questions about any of the technical part or something, I'm still around and I can still try and address those if you need to. If you have a more complex situation, or you're something specific to what you're working on that you need help with, I do encourage you to send me an email, or you can contact me specifically through chat here, and we can try and address your problem offline.
Okay, everybody, we are going to get started now. Yeah, so welcome back to my section. Andrew here again. Stephen did a fabulous job going over his respective section and give you guys lots of fantastic information on how an accessible site should be set up, and lots of techniques and lots of good info there. Moving into something that we do a lot of is we do a lot of accessibility testing. Some people call it ADA testing, some people call it Section 508 testing, some people call it accessibility testing. It's all the same thing. The first area of there's two forms of testing, and the first area we're going to touch on is automated. The other, you've got automated testing, and you've got manual testing. So looking at automated testing, there is big variety of tools, but automated testing in a nutshell is some form of scanning tool that is able to look through a site and identify code violations. It will check all of the testable content within a page or a site, and it'll flag a bunch of, usually a lot of potential issues or actual significant issues. Some examples of some automated testing tools would be we have Site Improve, we have Site Mapper, we have Dino Mapper, we have Wave, we have Axe, Axe Dev Tools. There's a bunch out there, and they vary in complexity. There are some testing tools that are designed for system engineers and require that level of technical proficiency to use the product in any meaningful way. There's some accessibility testing tools that are aimed at web content managers, and there's some tools that are aimed at kind of the more novice end user who's just kind of getting their feet wet with accessibility. So some pros and cons. Things that we've identified within our work over the last few years using automated testing tools. They are great for finding code violations, errors within the code. Allows the end user, which could be ourselves, to check large scale entire websites, looking to see if there's issues such as perhaps missing form field labels, missing alt text. It usually does a really good job of those type of issues. Most of them are fairly quick, sometimes just a few seconds, sometimes several hours. It just obviously depends on the size of the site and what type of testing tool it is and the complexity of the site and how many links are within that site. There are definitely some drawbacks. So a lot when companies market these tools, this is one thing they don't like to talk about. They actually only find about 32 to 33% of accessibility errors, which is not a lot, so about a third. And what we found happens is there's unfortunately lots of false positives, and sometimes there's some false negatives too, where the automated testing tool believes there's actually a violation and there's not a violation, or it'll search every single link within a domain, and they'll end up finding violations that aren't really there. Some things they can't address, they'll often flag color contrast issues that aren't actually there. That's quite common. And also just they can't address things that they can't address potential line items such as logical read and order, error validation, whether a site is actually keyboard navigable, so whether a site can be used keyboard only. So there's some value to automated testing tools, but the information you get back from them, I wouldn't say taken with a grain of salt. I would say the information is useful and can inform decisions if you're making data-driven decisions. So it's definitely good, helpful information. It can give you like a snapshot kind of health check of your agency or your state or your county or whatever's digital footprint. So it can be helpful for that for sure, but we should definitely realize there could be lots of issues that have been omitted, or there could be lots of false positives and it's skewing the results. And we've definitely seen that. We've seen that too. So the IT Accessibility Initiative, we actually, for basically since I started the role, came up with the idea of an audit. So we would audit state websites, and we would use an automated testing tool to conduct this audit. We would conduct this audit on a quarterly basis, and we would just try to give us an opportunity to figure out where each agency is with accessibility testing. It gives us an opportunity to introduce ourselves and collaborate and consult with various agencies as they're all diligently working to make sure their sites are as accessible as possible. Automated testing tools, what's helpful about it is that at least within the audit, it allowed us to give us data so we can potentially, okay, we know this is potentially an issue with site X. Let's go and do like more of a comprehensive manual test on that site and see if these issues actually are that are appearing within the report, see if they, see if they are there, and see what we can do to improve the accessibility of that site. So there's definitely some benefit from the quarterly audit. It's a approach we've been using for a few years. And if you're a state of Maryland, if you're with the state of Maryland and your respective agency is interested in learning more about how these reports could help your agency, definitely reach out to me or Stephen after today's seminar. We'd be happy to chat with you. There is lots of good information there. For sure, we can show progress as different remediations occur, or transitioning from for example, transitioning from one template to another template, and where you are in regards to how much maybe you've just done a big dump and added a bunch of new information to your site, and it's a good way to check, hey, I just want to do a quick spot check to see where we're at accessibility wise. So IT quarterly audit has definitely been helpful in the work that we do, and hopefully that information can be helpful in the work that you guys do too. Okay, so I'm gonna take you're gonna take over in a second, take over control of the presentation, and I'm gonna demonstrate an automated testing tool, and then Stephen's going to kindly share a sample dynamo mapper report, which is only tested to report, and we'll get a chance to talk about that. So let me yeah, I think I need to take control here, Stephen.
That's fine. You should be able to.
Okay, so should we share in screen?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay. So I'm looking at the Premier League website. I am from the UK, and I am a huge soccer fan. And every now and again, I have a look on this website to check, check the football scores, check the soccer scores, and see how my favorite Premier League team is doing. This website is one of the most popular websites on the planet. You have people checking this from all around the world, and they have millions of end users every month. So we're gonna use one particular tool today when we check the site, and so I'll just check it. The tool we're gonna use today is called Wave. So Wave is a single page automated testing tool, web accessibility evaluation tool, and it's made by the folks at WebAIM. They do a really good job. They're big advocates. They do a really good job of marketing this free testing tool, and they also do a good job about educating folks about accessibility too as well. So WebAIM does a really good job. So we've got this web accessibility testing tool in front of us. It has done an automated scan of just a single page. So it checked the home page. It's letting us know lots of information. It's letting us know here that the page has the language set, so it's good. Language is set to English. That makes sense. It's an English British website, and we're currently viewing it in English. It is very busy. There is alerts or functionality features, icons all over the screen. So I'm not going to get into every single thing. I'm going to encourage you guys to go play around with it, but I'm going to give you a quick tour around so you guys can learn a little bit about Wave. So Wave believes it's detected 173 errors on a homepage. That is a really, really staggering amount. Obviously, it's super disappointing to see that many errors or potential errors. It also believes it has found 50 contrast errors, so color contrast violations. It is saying there's 120 alerts. So these alerts could impact accessibility, but are likely not a violation, but they could be a violation. So it just wants you to alert you to these issues and wants you to just take a little look. There's 89 there's 89 features within the site, and that could be things like language set, that could be HTML5 landmarks, things that should be there. So that's good. Then there are structural elements. That is usually the structure of the site. That is your, as Stephen already talked about, that is that hidden infrastructure within a website. And it starts with the magic H1 and it goes through H6. Again, as Stephen prefaced earlier, each website should only use H1 once per page, and then 2 through 6 in a logical and coherent manner to set up a site with proper infrastructure. And then we have the 515 ARIA roles, or like roles present. So I'm going to hit details and just start looking into this. And it looks like it's saying 151 missing alt text from images within the site. That's a lot. So I'm just going to click on one, see what we come up with here. Okay. So I'm going to pick this one right here. It's a little picture of a wolf. This is actually the town I was born in. So this is a place called Wolverhampton. So I'm going to click on this. Missing alt text. Image text is not present. So if you hit reference, it's going to tell you why it's important. Missing alt text, obviously that impacts non-visual access users. So people who are relying on screen readers, people who are relying on combination magnification / screen reading technology, such as things like Zoom text, and anyone who's relying on text to speech. So as Stephen prefaced earlier, all non-text content should have a text alternative. So this doesn't have a text alternative. So it's telling us why it's important, why it matters, how to fix. If this little Wolverhampton Wanderers icon is not relevant, we could use that null alt attribute so the screen reader just goes ahead and ignores it. Then you can hit the other option. We saw the reference, then the next would be code. So the HTML code will pop up. You will see the image class. You will see the source there. And if it's possible, if there should be some alt text there, and there's not. So that's identified one issue. So obviously we've got hundreds to go through. We're not going to go through them. Not going to go through them all. We have an empty link here, so we click on that, and we can see that there's the link to the PremierLeague.com website, and then there's no link text, which would have been inserted there. This would be a level A WCAG issue. So it would be considered a critical blocker, same as the alt text, missing alt text. And then we have these color contrast violations. So it's saying that this is a color contrast violation. So let's go back and go to the top. So there's lots of violations with alt text. Let's keep looking down. You can see all of the features within the site. And you normally should just be able to, yep, we've got an alt text issue, and it'll show you the code. And in a little bit, I'm going to show you a tool that we use to test that, because these color contrast violations within Wave really need to be manually inspected, and I'm going to get to a little later. I'll show you how to use those tools. A little further down, we have the alerts. So there's a skipped heading level. So that would be potentially, if we look at the structure of the site, it looks like there's H1s, yep, H2s. Okay, we're noticing, I'm just gonna ask a question to chat. I want you to look on this in structure as I'm scrolling through structure right here. And chat, does anyone Does anyone notice, any issues here when they're looking within the structure? Lori, what are the, or Stephen, what is chat saying?
Sorry, so it says it looks like too many H1s.
Awesome. Thank you, Lori. So yep, chat, you guys are correct. There are way too many H1s. Stephen mentioned it, I believe, at least once or twice. There should be only one H1 per page. Although that's not an actual accessibility violation, it is an accessibility best practice. When we speak to colleagues and co-workers that rely on non-visual access, and we speak to other practitioners in the field, the multiple use of H1 is definitely problematic. So it's also highlighting, redundant links, maybe two links right next to each other that go to the same place, and it's going to highlight, and then it notes the features. So features, usually they have the green check. These are good things. So alt text being there, linked images with alt text. If you've got a figure, these are usually things that, language being set correctly to English, great. And then it goes through this structure as well. And you can see there's lots of H1s there. There's H2s, there's H3s, there's H4s, H5, there's no H6. And it's telling you the other structures and other features within the site, such as headers, footers, that type of thing. And then we have the 230 ARIA references there. And that is pretty much it for Wave, and I will stop sharing, and Stephen will restart sharing. We're now going to switch to, thank you, Stephen. So we've, in front of us is a report created by DynoMapper. DynoMapper is, it was originally created as a site mapping tool. So if you were if you were a webmaster and you were building our website and you wanted to map out your tool, map out your entire footprint to see how the site looked and the way you've created it, you would use this tool. However, I guess a little while after they launched the program, and like, hey, this accessibility thing could be a good thing. Let's add some accessibility features. So this website, this particular tool, DynoMapper, will attempt to find accessibility issues within a site, and then it will it'll tell you, it'll give you like a breakdown here, a summary, and saying, hey, there's 130 there's 130 issues with the site, 2 likely issues, 393 potential problems. So as we talked about earlier, with automated testing, while it is useful to give you some data, and it can direct you to be like, hey, there might be some issues here. There's actually some obviously obvious negatives. Unfortunately, with this particular tool, we get lots of false positives, or the reporting of the same issue, the exact same issue, multiple times. So the exact same issue could be referenced 30 times. So it would inherently pull down the accessibility score. Stephen's just kind of swinging through, and also it will search every single link, even old pages, for example, that aren't even public facing anymore. And unfortunately, it's going to, some of these pages that you can't even get to without using a crawling tool, it will find these pages, and it will count, these pages will count against your agency or your organization's accessibility score. So we take the accessibility scores, in all honesty, with a pretty big pinch of salt, almost the small Siberian salt mine. So yeah, it's a helpful tool as long as you understand the fact that you shouldn't focus too much on the score, but you should maybe just look at the types of issues that have been identified. Like if it's a bunch of just alt text, go ahead and probably worth doing a manual test. If 130 of those issues are relating to color contrast, well, if you, Stephen, if you scroll down a little bit, I think color contrast should be right there. Yeah, it is. So we look right here, we have, it thinks potential, it's saying it believes there's 52,000 accessibility issues with color. And, you know, we work with Do It pretty closely on a regular basis, and there's not really 52,000 issues. So we went in and checked, and in some cases, it's literally flagging anything with color. So that's obviously, these are pretty well-known problems with automated testing tools, especially around things like color contrast, where it will just, you know, unfortunately, for whatever reason, create lots and lots of false positives. And, you know, obviously these in turn are going to pull the scores down. So, you know, if we do see things like this, we'll go in and we'll start looking through, and we'll use different testing tools to manually test those sites. And, you know, if there was an issue, we would obviously let that respective agency know. So yeah, you know, we're very cautious when we use these tools, because, you know, you've definitely got to have a pretty decent understanding of accessibility. Otherwise, you kind of may react in a negative way when you think, hey, there's, you know, 300,000 issues with your website, when really there might be like 5. So yeah.
If I might just add something, Andrew.
Yep.
One nice thing about these kind of reports, though, is more if, like, because, you know, you use a style sheet in order to apply a look to multiple different elements, you know, like in the case of this color contrast thing, okay, it's found every single use of that across your entire website. So it's not just like on a single page or something, it's an entire domain. So, but that fix, if you fix it in the style sheet, that one fix cancels out, you know, 30,000 of those errors. So the best thing automated reports give you is making you aware of, like, the consistent factors like that. It's kind of like the HTML validation. You're finding all those errors that you're not going to find unless you read through the code manually, which is challenging for a person to do.
Thank you, Stephen. So yeah, yeah, as Stephen said, there's definitely value in these reports, and we definitely utilize them to kind of more, you know, point us in the right direction and help us, you know, inform the agencies if there is an issue with the style sheet, and then we can literally go in there, give them the hex, and they update it, and, you know, as Stephen mentioned, you know, and then you fix in 40,000 issues. So there's definitely some good functionality to these, and there is definitely value to automated testing. Manual testing. So there's 3 distinct areas as our team and other accessibility teams around the nation and the globe. When I speak to colleagues in Maine, or if I speak to colleagues in Minnesota, or speak to colleagues back in the UK, and who all are in the same field, we're all saying the same thing, that there's 3 distinct areas: planning and management of manual testing, and I'll explain the reason. And then you have the reason why there's so much work around planning and management is automated testing is very quick, prompt, and obviously it's, you know, you can even make it automated, so it just runs automatically, and all you have to do is, you know, pick up the reports. In fact, in some websites, some services, software, I believe Site Improve does this, will actually email you the automated report, so it's entirely automated. So you don't have to do anything; it just runs in the background and shoots you the reports. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done around the planning and management of manual testing. Manual testing takes an absolutely massive amount of time. It can take, you know, it can take a few hours just to do a couple of pages. It usually takes, you know, over, you know, 48 to, you know, 50 something man hours just to hit a website's, you know, kind of main pages and maybe some of the sub pages. Manual testing is very, very time intensive, and it's not something that can just be, you know, left for one person to do. I mean, it could be, but, you know, there's definitely there's definitely a lot of work that goes into it, and the amount of time and resources it takes, it's valuable, but it's going to take time. Next would be the procedures and techniques. There's lots of there's lots of different approaches to testing. The approach that we kind of use here is the trusted tester kind of Department of Homeland Security modality. We kind of use that trusted tester approach that lots of different organizations and states and federal government use. There's specific tools, and we kind of use that model, and then we actually add some additional options on there as well. And then we've got, various tools that we use, such as, we have manual testing tools, and we'll get into that in a second. So to focus on the planning and management process, the first thing you need to do is site owner or the team for that particular agency needs to think about how many pages for the site in total. So if it is the website, is it like 20 pages? Like if it's a small website, perfect, do the entire website. If it's a large domain and you've got 400,000 pages or 30,000 pages, be fantastic if you could test every single page, if you have a team big enough that has the capacity to do that. But in reality, most people do not. So at this stage, the site owner needs to determine how deep is the dive going to be. So some of the options. So we could look at just looking at the homepage. We could let's look at the main pages and then the sub pages and the feature pages. Okay, we'll take it even step further. We'll hit the search pages and even look as far as the search pages results. I think something that makes sense to our team at least would be if your website is using Google Analytics, you could be like, you know what, I'm going to test my main pages, and on top of that, I'm going to hit up my 10 pages with the most traffic per month over a 6-month average. So these decisions can be data driven, or it could be just intuition. Ideally data driven, but whatever information you've got, and it could just be experience. You'd be like, hey, I know that this application to financial aid is going to be used constantly, nonstop. Then we'll make sure that page and the respective application works from start to finish. And then you've got looking at form pages, table pages. Another way to think about planning out the process of actual manual testing would be testing the template variants. So if you've got a one column website, you've got a title and a one column, you've got a title, nav bar, sidebar, footer, and 2 columns or 3 column. Test the homepage, then test all the different template variants, and then from there you can apply those remediations to the style sheet and use that universally across the other pages as well. So that would be a great way to, again, using those template variants as a way to map out how you test. But it's definitely important that as you embark on manual testing, that you have a plan. Stephen and I, before we test, we always have a quick check-in, and we'll say, hey, this is what we're going to look at. So Stephen will be like, hey, we're going to look, let's do main pages, sub pages. And I'll be like, okay, let's add this into, and we've noticed there's an application on that. We'll check out those forms as well. And we also noticed there's a couple of documents. It's not 50 documents, it's like 2. So we'll check those documents too as well. And in regards to document testing, that's something that's super important. Remember as well, if you've got a beautifully accessible website that has a great user experience, and then you've got like a page that has like 200 documents on it and they're all inaccessible, you have an inaccessible website. You need to make sure that all content on your site is accessible. And I know that can be a lot. So if you're an agency that has hundreds, thousands, or even millions of documents, and you're interested in talk about accessibility, that would definitely be the time to look to do a consult with us. And we can get into, hey, you know what, you've got, a million documents dating back from, the 1600s, probably not going to be possible to remediate all those documents. let's create a, a really good solid accessibility statement on the website. And let's make sure there's a clear and manageable way to make sure that all new documents are accessible, but that those older documents, they can be made, they can be available in an accessible format upon request. That would be a solid way of managing a website. But if you've got like five, if you have 5 documents, that is not an appropriate approach on your site. But if you've got like, millions, hundreds of thousands of documents, that isn't a reasonable approach. And that would be an approach that, could be backed up in a court of law if you were ever in a situation where they said, well, all your documents aren't accessible. But, if you're in those hundreds of thousands, when it would be an unreasonable burden. But if you've got just a few documents, you better make sure they're accessible. There's no exceptions if you've got just a low number of documents on your website and them being inaccessible. So we've got testing tools and some tips. Obviously, it's key to make sure that we've got the skip to main content link needs to be present on every page. It's always definitely should be, as you load up that website and you get that home page, and it should be, once you hit that tab key, that skip to main content link should appear, and it should remain there while it's on focus, and then when you tab away, it can be hidden. Skip to main content link needs to be present. Heading structure, Stephen's already touched on this. I'm not going to go on and on about it. We've got that H1 through 6. We need to make sure heading structures is coherent, makes sense, is logical. Alt text for non-text items. There needs to be a text alternative. We know that. Stephen's already talked about that. Keyboard navigable. Websites, you need to be able to go through the entire website, keyboarding through it, whether that's using tab keys or shift and tab. You need to be able to, or arrow keys. You need to be able to navigate through that whole website with all functionality, using enter, space, whatever the keyboard keys you're using. That web page needs to be accessible. If you've got some type of multimedia that auto plays and just pops up, there needs to be a way to be able to either hide that, play that, pause and stop. Like, it needs to be controllable if it's over a few seconds long. Thinking about traps, it's really important that you should be able to navigate around your website without getting trapped in a particular component of the site. For example, getting trapped in a Twitter feed where you kept hitting tab and you're just going further and further down the list. You're using the up and down arrow keys and you still can't get out. It's just, that was an example. Make sure that any elements or features you add to the site need to be accessible. We've got tiny text. We need to make sure that tiny text is on the screen, and it needs to be above font size 9. Then reading level. So wherever possible, sometimes this is tricky, but we need to try to, wherever possible, use plain English within a website. Make sure that we write in a pragmatic way, especially for state agencies, or if you work for a municipal government. We need to make sure that whatever content we're putting out public facing needs to be plain English and understandable. There needs to be a consistent navigation method to the site. I know Stephen already touched on this, so I'm not going to keep going on about it, but you need a bit, as you navigate through a site or application, it needs to be consistent all the way through. Use of color. We shouldn't use color to convey meaning ever. And there needs to be a visible focus indicator present when we have focus on a particular element. So some manual testing tools. We have good old-fashioned inspector, which is just right-click inspect that's there within the browser. We then have Andy. We have the color contrast analyzer tool that we should probably be using, screen reader, and then we have a readability test. So this is good old-fashioned inspector. We use that on a regular basis. That would be just using a right mouse click or touchpad click, and then just hitting inspect on an individual element. the elements will pop up. You'll see the HTML there. You'll be able to address particular, you'll be able to see, hey, is the alt tag there? Is whatever piece of code you're looking for, where it's supposed to be, are labels properly associated, IDs and labels, do they match, are they associated with each other? That's where you'd find all that great information from. I definitely recommend, if you're not familiar with HTML, there's a great website to learn HTML at your own pace, and it's W3 Schools. And we can put that in the chat as well, great resource. So now we're going to switch. we're going to show you Andy. So I will share my screen. Okay, so I'm back to the Premier League website. This is definitely a favorite website in the Drummond house. I'm going to open up a different page though, so we can see something different. Okay, so Andy's right there. I open Andy up. Okay, so Andy has several modules, and they're first just focusable elements. And when we're in focusable elements, I just select that, and I can look through the individual elements. It's going to allow me to, so the first one, as you can see, is skip to main content. Great, it's there, it's on focus. I go away from it. I can move through. Andy is going to show me what the inner text says. It's going to show me what the Andy output says. So this is what Andy believes a screen reader would announce this as. So the club's called Arsenal. It's the best team in the world. You probably don't know that, but it is. So we have Arsenal Football Club there, and then we go to the next one, Aston Villa, not so good. And then we go through, and it's going to go through all the different elements, and it's going to say, okay. And this is great as you test them, because you can say, yeah, you can see which elements which focusable elements have text that go along, that are labeled correctly, and have text that go along with them. So I'm looking through, and I'm not seeing a lot here, but I do see a bunch of accessibility alerts. So the first one is elements with no accessible name. So let me click on that. So it's saying button element has no accessible name. Okay, it's in element removed from DOM, refresh Andy. So it wants me to refresh Andy. So just like all technology, Andy can get a little quirky at times. It's going to ask you to refresh. Usually sometimes you can just work with a quick refresh there. Sometimes you have to refresh the whole browser. Again, I was just looking through the elements. It's only found 2 this time. It's found a button, and it's found a link. So it's saying that particular link has no ID, there's no accessible name, and you can go ahead and look at the code. Let's just get on to graphics. I know we still have quite a bit of content to get through, and I'm looking at the time here. So graphic alerts, we only got one graphic alert. So these are the graphics it's going through. Great, looks good. I'm saying that all of these little images, they're labeled appropriately. That's just saying there's background in the background. We know the background and the screen is decorative, so I'm fine with that. And then I'm going to go to links and buttons. It's going to then pull up all the links within the site, and it would let me know if there was any issues with the links. It believes there's lots of keyboard access alerts. It's basically saying that this might be a link that only works with a mouse. So it believes that these links along the top are going to be outside of keyboard tab order. So I'll be able to check that in a second. So it's looking through, it's doing the same thing, letting you know Andy output, and I can actually hit the new links list, and it has the link number, alert, accessible name and description, not what we announced, and then the respective href. And it'll let you scroll down. And if there's an issue, yep. So there's an issue here with this one PremierLeague.com link. There's no accessible name. There's nothing there. So that would be how you would find the issue with that particular. We can go into tables. If there's tables within the site, it would let you know if there's any issues with it. saying there's the tables list, data table with no name. So the table needs to be linked. It's saying it's also found TD, which is a deprecated attribute. So it's using a previous version of, so when this website was coded, it's using a previous version of HTML in parts. This is probably really good, what Stephen talks about all the time. When you're building out websites, he mentions this all the time. Don't copy and paste old stuff. So if you're moving from one new website to another site or doing a big upgrade, that copy paste can be problematic. And especially like this, when you're copying in older versions of HTML. We got structure here as well. And it will tell you the structure. So it'll say there's 10 headings. It'll let me know the headings. So it'll say, so we got H4, we got an H1. It looks like we've got a skipped heading alert. Yep, we skipped H2 out. So we know that's an accessibility challenge, but it's, you know, it's not really an issue. It's an accessibility challenge. We'll keep it at that. Then color contrast. What I like about Andy a lot is, especially for color contrast, you can see how we have that pink square around like we do when we know we're on focus and we're looking through the elements. And it's going to tell you that, like, hey, this text does not meet color contrast standards. It'll say it's a fail. And as you move through, it lets you know what's a pass. And it's super helpful. You get it. And also we can look at hidden content too. So it'll mark up any hidden content as well. Oh, it just jumped me to another website. Okay, so anyway, we are good with we're good with that share. So I'm gonna stop sharing, and we can go back to the slide deck, Stephen. Thank you, sir. Next, we're gonna do. Next, I'm going to show you accessible color picker really quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've got it just right there up in my on my nav bar. I just hit accessible color picker, and I just hit on the little dropper there, and I can check to see if it's accessible. Let me pick I just pick the foreground, that's the background, and it's going to pull out a score, 12.41, AAA compliant, and it gives me the actual hex as well for the foreground color and the background color. So that's how we use accessible color picker. Very, very simple. It's made by our friends Level Access. They are based in Tysons Corner, Virginia, and they do lots of good work. Thank you for sharing those, Stephen. I appreciate that in the chat. And level this between Andy's color picker, color contrast tool, and Level Access's color contrast tool. I think you'll be in really good shape. So we've got mobile testing modalities. So mobile testing, we've got 3 primary modalities for as we test on mobile. So we got Android, Android OS, and Apple's iOS testing. So so that would be Stephen testing with Android, myself testing with Apple, and we would use the native accessibility features built, which is the assistive technology built within the mobile site to test. And we would go ahead and then we'll be testing on those mobile devices. Next would be using a responsive window. So that's just resizing a window on desktop and to a mobile size device size. And then finally would be just straight up just testing on desktop. When we're going through these different modalities, I think it's the most important thing, in my opinion, is making sure that you use an Android device and an iOS device, even though they're both the 2 completely different operating systems, and we constantly see different results. Not with every single thing, but something might work really, really well with Stephen's Android OS's TalkBack, which is their screen reader, and then it works very poorly with Apple's iOS. Apple's iOS is VoiceOver. So it really does depend between devices, and it's definitely definitely important to use both devices to test per site, whether it's a website or application. And mobile testing, again, making sure that if you see anything that's auto playing, are you able to pause it, stop it, hide it? When you activate the multimedia, whether it's a carousel or some type of social media application within a website, do you get trapped there? Make sure you don't get trapped there. Are you able to resize the text? Are you able to use the native accessibility features within the phone to resize the site? Was the site created with responsive design? Very important. Make sure there's consistent navigation. You're probably seeing there's a lot of follow-over. There's so much carryover between just desktop testing and mobile. It is really very similar. And finally would then be color utilization. Stephen's already talked about this, not using colors to convey meaning, not using color to make choices or make decisions. And I believe that is the last slide for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. We are just going to go ahead and try and power through the last bit because we don't have too much left. We are running up into our last hour, so I'll just hang on. We should be able to get through this, and then we'll try and address any last minute questions. So, screen reader testing. The reason we do screen reader testing is because it does change quite a bit how you interact with the computer, how you interact with the machine. Mostly because it's not just keyboard only access, or rather, it changes a lot of what the keyboard can do for you. And the screen reader, most of them are smart enough nowadays where they're able to kind of pull apart elements and even make somewhat inaccessible things work. They're not going to be great, but they'll still work. So the screen reader, it's one of the most common forms of assistive technology that we're going to encounter, and it's really necessary. We will occasionally test with other kinds of assistive technology, like physical hardware inputs and such, but a lot of that comes down to more, can the computer handle that? Whereas a screen reader, we're changing what the computer does. So I would recommend, if you're going to be starting with screen reader testing, if you're going to try it out yourself, if you're working on Windows, download NVDA from nvaccess.org. I can get that link to you afterwards. But it is a free screen reader. They do ask for donations, but you can download it for free, get updates for free. It is comparable to JAWS, which is job access with speech. JAWS is kind of the most known and most used one, it is the most used screen reader at this time. You're going to find it mostly in the workplace and such, but for testing purposes, NVDA, non-visual desktop access, is just as good. There are some things it does better than JAWS. There are some things it's not quite as good as with JAWS, but it gives you everything you need and you'll be able to do it for free. Whereas JAWS, you have to pay quite a bit for that license to use it. So JAWS is better for those who are actually blind or low vision and need the tool in their workplace. If you're using an Apple computer, Mac OS, you're going to be using the built-in screen reader instead, VoiceOver. NVDA and JAWS don't function on Mac. There isn't really anything comparable to VoiceOver. VoiceOver is quite good. A lot of blind users quite enjoy it, so, or at least get enough out of it that they have no complaints about it or minimal complaints. So those are your two main tools, or NVDA and VoiceOver, depending on which machine you're running. No matter which one you're using though, I really strongly recommend that you go through the tutorials. There are a lot of different keyboard shortcuts and different kinds of inputs that you can use with the screen reader in order to interact with a website or an application and such. There are some other settings that will be useful to you as we go along, but the tutorials will explain all that honestly probably better than I can and in a better time frame. So the main thing to know, though, are the shortcuts for things that we're going to be testing, such as headings, graphics, landmarks, and links. With NVDA and JAWS, that's like H for headings or G for graphics. Tab moves through all, moves through all of the focus elements. Shift tab moves backwards through all the focusable elements. Other parts of navigation are done with arrow keys, like menu items, like a drop-down list or something, or with like NVDA, it's in order to read text. Same with VoiceOver. VoiceOver, depending on if you're using the default settings, you might have to press another keyboard or your options and command buttons in order to make it to do that, or you can set it to not do that. But those are your main tools for getting around in a website or an application. There is 2 modes for both of these. NVDA calls them browse and focus mode. That's why I call them that. I believe JAWS calls focus mode edit mode. Essentially, that's just the difference between being able to move around freely and moving like within a region or interacting with a region. Focus mode is kind of more, you're mostly using it when you're either like working in a document or you're working with a form, that kind of thing. Most of the time it'll switch automatically for you, but sometimes you need to be able to do that yourself so that if you get stuck, you're able to get out of it. You're not going to be, you will be, if this is the first time you've ever used one, you're going to be learning. You keep that in mind, is you're really more trying to get at least a basic understanding of how to use the screen reader so that you can establish how tricky is a website to use, or can it, am I getting information that is critical for the user to get without having to jump through a bunch of hoops. Some useful settings I would suggest you turn on. All of them have a visible focus indicator, which is very useful for testing purposes because it kind of tells us where on the screen our screen reader is. It also helps with finding invisible elements that the screen reader picks up, but we don't actually see. And you'll at least know kind of where, in what region is that element. VoiceOver also has a captions window, which is really nice. It helps for both providing screenshots for people. If, here's an example of what the issue is or what a screen reader is outputting for that. It also will give you, depending on your verbosity settings and such, it'll give you like the full breakdown of that element and what it did, what it is, what it does, and what other commands you can use to interact with it. So they're very useful for helping to identify issue locations. You can adjust the speech, pitch, and rate to your preference. Be aware that as you adjust the speed, as you start getting more and more used to it, it will start affecting your task completion time. That's perfectly normal. Most screen reader users who describe themselves as intermediate to advanced are going to be having it running at a significantly faster rate than you will be. So if it's not taking you much time to complete a task with the slow speech, it's probably going to take them even less time. So that's great. It's one of the things that you're just going to adjust over time, but be aware that you can, make sure to choose something that, at least is comfortable to listen to, because you're going to be listening to it a lot. I do recommend also turning off speak type characters. Just that way, when you're like trying out a form or you're, working with a document or something, you don't hear every single key press. Words is the more useful of the two options there. In some cases, You might also turn that off yourself because you're not really testing the screen reader's ability to give you that feedback. But occasionally it's useful just to have the words on as well, just so you can hear when you put something in and if you've moved off to something else. And then any other settings, you can adjust as preferred over time, but honestly, most of the default settings are best for testing purposes because we're kind of trying to, when we're testing, we're trying to figure out what is the broadest net. What are we doing that is going to affect the most users? Because we want to make sure that we're making this easy for as many people as possible. So the default settings kind of give us that example of how maybe a novice user will be moving around your website and what troubles are they going to encounter. An advanced screen reader user who's been working with it for years is going to have no trouble dealing with a keyboard trap or moving down to the footer and finding the contact us link or something. Whereas a novice user might not know to jump from landmark to landmark, or they'll jump down to the footer, but they don't know how to get to, filter through the 4 lists down there or something. So they instead scroll through every link, things like that. When you're testing with the screen reader, you're looking for most of the same things Andrew discussed in this past section. But what you're also looking for is that information it gives to you, reading to you, enough that you know what to do with it and that it is actually functional. There are occasions where the screen reader will also change how things work, like with a nav drop-down menu. If you're using keyboard only without a screen reader, you can probably tap through those links and it'll just move through everything. Whereas the screen reader might say instead, oh, there's a submenu here, press the down arrow to open that submenu. So it does kind of change sometimes the behaviors of the site. So that's why we need to make sure that we're running through the same things with the screen reader as opposed to just keyboard only access. So we have that skip to main content link. That is the very first thing that we hear it. He will hear it on page load. Occasionally, if you don't give enough time or you miss it, you'll just go to the next element and then come back, make sure that you hear it then, and that it actually works and it sends you to a reasonable place. Occasionally, the skip to main content link will actually send you further down the page than you would have wanted. It's more intended to skip the header bar and the nav menu and such. So making sure that it functions. Sometimes it will also visually move you, but focus the actual place where the screen reader is and will move from into the next thing or not, doesn't move. And that's a major problem. As Andrew mentioned, and I mentioned previously, that headers, nav menu links are in a logical reading order. That comes up a lot with mobile testing because since your nav menu is probably going to be open or closed by a button, we see a lot of instances where you press that button but then you move to the next item and it's not the nav menu, because the nav menu, they just took the existing desktop nav menu and just changed visually where it is or how it visually appears. But because there's other stuff in between, you don't have that logical connection of, I press this button, where's the thing that I pressed that button for? So that's something to look for, and just making sure that as you're reading through the rest of the content, that it's also kind of how you intend a user to actually read your content, because that's really what you're trying to achieve. Screen readers ignore, for the most part, styling and scripting and such. So that's where that document object model order comes in, because where things are in your code is how the screen reader will interpret them. And so if you don't have, if you have like 3 columns, but they have headings and the headings are in a separate, row or something, the screen reader is going to read those 3 headings in order and then read through the 3 columns in order. So you have to change the code in order to be, heading, column, heading, column, heading, column, so the screen reader will read it the same way you want someone to visually read it. We have the heading levels and structure, those landmarks, making sure that we have that way to jump around the website easily and in a logical order. Running through the graphics, making sure that they have alt text, making sure that alt text tells us why this is important or what it does. That's kind of a subjective judgment. You're going to be using your best judgment in those cases, but making sure that it's not just generic or that it actually helps us and gives us more information. Or in some cases, if it's a graphic that doesn't add anything, does the screen reader skip it? If it does, and we don't need that, that doesn't give us anything, that's actually good. We want to make this a streamlined experience for these people who are using these tools. All elements that are intended to be in keyboard tab order are keyboard navigable. So that's mostly, and we say not just arrow keys, but tabbable. So things that are supposed to be focusable and interactive, we need to make sure tab works with them. There are expected behaviors with the screen reader, such as, like I mentioned, drop downs and such. Those are supposed to open with arrow keys, but it does, like that nav menu, does it appear when I focus it, or do I have to activate it to focus it? Or if I activate that, does it send me to another page? Because that's also a link, and so the screen reader can't get at the sub menu because it can't open it. Those are the kind of things, making sure that everything we can get to and use. You want to sometimes check any complex language and readability, especially if you're either dealing with other languages or if you're working with like a lot of project names and acronyms. That's mostly just to make sure that the screen reader is pronouncing those correctly or close enough. A lot of blind users are aware the screen reader is not going to be perfect in those regards, but there are things you can do to mitigate that. Like we've mentioned, title, providing the full acronym name instead. If you're working with languages, you can add the HTML attribute lang and add in the short phrase for whatever language it is, so that the screen reader will read Spanish as if it was Spanish rather than trying to read Spanish as English. Forms, menus, and buttons, that they're labeled, that they're working correctly, that we get feedback when we mess something up in them, that buttons are functionable, that they work with the space bar or enter key, essentially making sure that things that we need are working with on focus rather than on just when we're hovering over them. And then finally, task completion. This is kind of the main way you address this kind of testing, is trying to do something on your website as if you were a blind or low vision user. So I want to find the application for a fishing license on this website. Okay, I know where I need to go. How do I do it with the screen reader? Do I have to tab through everything to get to the link to that form? And then when I'm on that form, do I, when I run through the form, do I hear it? Or can I just press, H to jump to the second heading? I hear licensing, and then I can press, tab or L for lists, and then get to the list that has fishing licensing in it, run through it, and I get to it, and boom. It's a lot faster. So really, you're trying to determine just how efficient and how easily a person can achieve these things compared to as if you were using a mouse and running through as a sighted person. When you're testing, if you're new to this, it is going to take you more time. So it's not so much the actual time, like 5 minutes versus 3. It's more about how many inputs does it take you to achieve that task. Okay, I have a demo of NVDA, and I hope I am sharing the audio. So
NVDA settings, speech, normal configuration. General 1 of 13. Speech 2 of 13. Speech property page. Change. Voice. Combo box Microsoft Zero Desktop English. Unit rate. Slider 70 all plus R. 71, 72, 79, 80, 88, 83.
So you can hear how it's speeding up and telling you
99.
essentially what percentage
100,
of speed it
99.
is.
80, 79, 67, 69,
This
70.
is running through
Pitch,
the
slider
settings that
50 all plus
NVDA
51.
has.
85, 84, 55, 54, 35, 36, 54, 55. Volume, slider 100 all plus O.
Okay, someone said the audio is not coming through. Let me check my sharing settings.
This is Lori. I'm hearing it on this end.
You're hearing it on that end? Okay, good.
Yeah, looks like a
Thank
few
you.
others are hearing it as well. At the
Okay,
moment.
great. I just want to make sure because it's kind of hard to demonstrate the screen reader
NVDA
if you
settings.
can't hear it.
Speech, normal configuration, switching, when automatic
All right, I'm gonna
punctuation
jump
/ symbol level,
to
trust
here.
voices language when processing characters and symbol, include Unicode consortium
Okay,
data.
thank you, everyone.
Including
I
capital
appreciate
pitch,
it.
say cap before capitals, beep for capitals checkbox not checked all plus B. Use spelling functionality if supported checkbox checked all plus, okay but, cancel, apply, space.
So a lot of those settings are more just like the behaviors it'll have, like how you differentiate between a capital letter or a capital word versus lowercase. You know, it can either beep for you, or it can change pitch, how much you want it to change pitch, or it can just say this is capitalized. Most of the time, those are off. You only use like the pitch change or something. It's more common, but again, this is just more showing you what is this capable of, which is quite a bit.
Apply button all plus, cancel, OK button. OBS link. List with 2 items inaccessible news page. Welcome to City Lights. Clickable inaccessible news page before and after demo. No next heading at level 1. No next heading at level 1. No next heading at level 2. No next heading at level 2.
So this website is W3's demo of an inaccessible version of a site versus an accessible version. And as you notice, I'm in this demonstration here, I am pressing the shortcut for headings. And it's telling me on the inaccessible version, there's no headings at all. So I can't jump down to like man gets 9 months in a violin case, which is the second news story on this site.
No next heading at level 3. No next heading at level 4. No next heading at level 5. No next heading. Red dot with a white letter C that symbolizes a moon crescent as well as the sun. This logo is followed by a black banner that says City Lights, which is the name of this online portal. Finally, the slogan of the portal, your access to the city, follows in a turquoise green handwriting style and with a slight slant across the top banner.
So that whole thing was the description of the logo for this City Lights demo page. And it didn't actually tell me this is for City Lights. It gave me this, big long description of their logo, which is too much information and not helpful. So that's where that example of you need to make that judgment call of, is this enough alt text? Is it too much? Does it tell me what I need to know?
Graphic link. To get missing image descriptions, open the context menu. NAV Home unlabeled graphic link. NAV News unlabeled graphic link. NAV Facts unlabeled graphic link. NAV Survey unlabeled graphic link. Block quote picture of Clara F. Graphic link. MRSB Wahoni investigates shipping hot air to Australia graphic. No next graphic. Inaccessible news page before and after demonstration heading level 1.
So those NAV links were the home news, tickets, and survey sidebar links. Because they had graphics attached to them, they were coming up when I pressed the shortcut for graphics. But as you notice, it didn't have descriptions, and it was giving insufficient explanation of what that was, And then the other 2 images were labeled, and they were probably okay for what they were.
No next landmark.
I'm gonna jump
Come to City
ahead.
Lights. Copyright link. Table. Show and list. Accessible news page visited.
There we go.
City Lights News accessible news page. Clickable. Access. Show and tickets link. Survey. Template. List with 2 items. Skip to content. Within demo page. Skip to navigation. Within demo page. City Lights. Your access to the city. Explore site by topic.
So you notice how that time the City Lights logo just said City Lights, your access to the city. Because, when I go to a website like this, I kind of just want to know that I'm on the right one. It also had that skip to main content link at the start. They went above and beyond having that skip to navigation link because they have other information in between it and the link. That's not required, but hey, they made the extra effort and gave an extra tool for people to use. You do have to be somewhat careful with that because there are occasions where you're providing too many things and people get overwhelmed, choice parallelization. But you do want to give people more than one option.
Combo box quick menu collapsed. Go button. List with 4 items home link. Tickets link. Survey link. Link ticket news. Link home. News. Link ticket. Link survey. The way that air conditioning works link. Trombone forgery debacle link. Clara FS website graphic link. Clara F. 15 months link. Copyright link. Brain donations for May. Clara FS website graphic link. MRSB Wahoni in front of a Kenyan graphic. Sunny spells graphic. City lights. Your access to the city. Graphic link.
So it's telling you what's a graphic link, that kind of thing. That's why you don't have to add like photo of or graphic link to. The screen reader does that for you. You can rely on it for some of this.
Explore site by topic. Combo box collapsed quick traffic. Today, Tuesday, March 1st. Heading level 2 navigation menu. List with 4 items link home. News. Link ticket. Link survey. Out of list heading level 1 city lights news. Heading level 2 heatwave link to temperatures. After 3 years of effort, city scientists now agree that the primary cause of the 2003 heatwave was hot air from our air conditioning units. The study cost the city taxpayer under $10 million, said Professor Stephen Wahoni, of City University Public Expenditure on Science Department. We had 5 top statisticians working on it, 1 to write the grant proposal, 1 to do the mathematical modeling, 2 to collaborate on the research paper, and 1 to hire a student to do the job.
So that's how the screen reader was reading that whole paragraph. So, and I was going through the headings in order to show you how jumping through those headings led me to that news story. And then I would use control and the down arrow with NVDA in order to read the entire story at once. So that's how NVDA kind of just briefly works and sounds like. And then we're going to look at VoiceOver and some of its little differences and such. All right, there's no closed captioning on this because VoiceOver has a caption window, so you'll still be able to see the captions. You'll just need to look in the corner. And I think I need to jump ahead quick. Oh, yes. One important thing to notice with VoiceOver is on the navigation in the utilities menu for it, you do need to check the behaviors of it because you need to make sure that it is allowing the keyboard to operate everything. So you need the keyboard focused item setting. And then in the web one, you want to make sure that you're using the DOM order as your navigation item versus the grouping items, because grouping will just try and intelligently read the website, and that's not always going to work because that's VoiceOver and Apple guessing what is it. So using the DOM order is honestly preferable. You do want to make sure that you're navigating images always for testing purposes, because you want to make sure if something has a description or if it doesn't, why, and then answer why. So.
Welcome to City Lights. Inaccessible homepage. Web content. Link. Skip to inaccessible demo page. Chrome has new demo starts here. You are currently on a text element inside of webcom. Visited link image. Red dot with a white letter C that symbolizes a moon crescent as well as the sun. This logo is followed by a black banner that says City Lights, which is the name of this online portal. Finally, the slogan of the portal, your access to the city, follows in a turquoise green handwriting style and with a slight slant across the top banner. Chrome has new window.
So VoiceOver works
Heading
pretty
not
much
found.
the same. It looks for the same
Heading
kind
not
of
found.
things. It just
Slash top
has
underscore logo underscore next
a
underscore
little bit
end
of a
gif unlabeled
different
slash top
way it
underscore weather gif unlabeled
interacts.
image.
Tab and Shift tab still move through focusable elements, but if you want to start moving through shortcuts or through other parts of the content like text or something, that's when you need to use the voiceover commands.
You are /top_logo_next_start GIF unlabeled image /mark GIF image /marker2_w GIF.
And as you notice, because by default it has the high verbosity, it's listing out images. It's giving you like, okay, it doesn't have a name or a description. So instead, here is like just the file name or its URL. So it's at least trying to give you something to work with.
/marker2 /nav_home GIF unlab /marker/nav_news GIF unlabeled /mark/nav_facts GIF /marker/nav_save GIF unlabeled image.
You'll notice that it was also pulling out the markers in between each of those versus NVDA, which skipped them. Part of that is just because of the settings for each of these, but then VoiceOver will try and pull out all of the elements, whereas NVDA, if NVDA judges it not being important to you, it might ignore it. And vice versa. There are occasions where NVDA will pick out something and VoiceOver will decide to skip it. That's very common with ARIA. Apple products don't always interact with ARIA well. So that's where those differences between the two is going to play out. So ideally, you will test with both. However, if you're unable to do that, or don't have the time to do that, most of the time you're going to have the same experience across either platform.
/marker2 /blank_ welcome to City Lights. City Lights is the new portal for visitors and residents. Find out what's on, book tick /headline link, heat wave linked to temperatures. You are currently on a link /headline_middle GIF unlabeled image. Link, man gets 9 months in violent case. /headline_middle GIF unlab link, lack of brains behind his research. Image, empty group, image, empty group, image, empty group.
And that's where that reading order comes into play, because it reads each of the titles of the news stories in a row, and then it reads the images. That's because in the document object model order, the DOM order, it lists each of those in those sections. But logically, you would want to read the title, then look at the image, and then read the story. So that's where, okay, we're having this issue here because the screen reader is interpreting it differently than a sighted person would. So that's a violation.
After 3 years of effort, city scientists now agree that the primary cause of the 2003 heat wave was hot air from our. You are currently on a text element inside of web content. To exit this web area, press Control, Option, Shift, up arrow.
That's the nice thing about VoiceOver too, is that it'll give you like hints or explanations of, okay, you're on this element, here's what you can do with it. So that's one of the benefits of it, because it'll give you those instructions afterwards. You can turn that off if you find yourself getting used to this thing, or I don't know, want to challenge yourself or whatever. You can tell it to stop giving you those information or that information.
Heading level 1 3 items. Inaccessible homepage, before and after demonstration. You are currently on a heading level 1, improving a website using web content accessibility guideline. List 6, link, current log home. List 2, inaccessible. Chrome has homepage, link, visited, link. Link, image.
Now, sometimes when a page reloads, NVDA and JAWS will like announce the title of the page and such. VoiceOver instead does that little bloop sound, that beep sound for you. It's usually also when content updates or something, VoiceOver gives that audible feedback. And NVDA and JAWS won't always do that, especially if there's no markup to do that. So there are occasions where VoiceOver will pick out things that the other two won't.
W3C link, skip to access group. Link, skip to content within demo page. Link, skip to navigation within demo page. Quick menu, explore site by topic. Go button. Visited link, news, link, tickets, link, survey. You are currently on a link. To click this link, press Control, Option, Space. Heading level 1, welcome to City Lights. Heading level 2, link, heat wave linked to temperatures. You are after 3 years of effort, city scientists now agree that the primary cause of the 2003 heat wave was hot air from.
As you notice, the screen reader skipped the image, and that's because the image has been marked with a null alt attribute. And if we're looking at it, we see a guy wearing a sun hat, but does that really help us with the story? It can be argued either way, but it's not a violation here because, yeah, that image isn't giving us additional information or context and contextually relevant information. It's kind of more just a way to draw people's eyes to that story. So that's why we can safely argue, yeah, we can ignore that image. If you had added the alt text to it, man wearing a sun hat, that would be fine too. Either way works. It's just best practice is we're going to make that call of, yeah, okay, this image is kind of not giving me anything new or isn't helpful. We can safely skip it then.
Link. Heat wave. Full store. Heading level 2. Link.
I should also have mentioned, you can also notice how it's now reading down that entire column, unlike the inaccessible version. So that means the reading order is now matching the DOM order too. Those full story links are good to point out as well, because in the inaccessible version, those are just read more links. And because there's like 4 read more links on the page, we don't know which one applies to what. And they aren't programmatically associated, because if I read the paragraph before it, it doesn't read the link with it. So it needs to have the ability to stand on its own then.
Man gets 9 months in violent case. Bear. These kinds of crimes need more creative, effective punishments. For example, link. Violent case. Full story. Heading level 2. Link. Lack of brains behind his research. Brain donations. Huge drop off in brain donations.
All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on. But that's essentially kind of how voiceover works. They're very similar because they're supposed to do the same thing. But there are some key differences in what voiceover gives you and how it interacts with it. And then there are some times when you're testing, you're going to come across things where NVDA will focus something and vice versa, or voiceover won't, or vice versa, where voiceover finds something and NVDA didn't. That occasionally comes up with forms too, where for whatever reason, the forms are interpreted differently or aren't working the same way. Next, please. Okay. Now, mobile device screen readers. Android has TalkBack. TalkBack is actually separate from Voice Assistant. If you go into the settings on your phone, there is an accessibility menu, and then it's kind of near the bottom. The very first thing in the accessibility menu is actually screen reader. That's actually separate from TalkBack. You actually have to go down to installed services and go to TalkBack. You can still use the voice assistant or screen reader, but TalkBack is honestly better. It's a bit more robust and has more controls, so you're better off testing with it, because I think most people are going to use that instead of the basic voice assistant. iOS has essentially the same thing as the desktop version. It has VoiceOver. The only difference is that it's using touch commands instead of keyboard commands. Both are available either on the phone or the tablet, depending on which iOS or what OS you're using. Just make sure that you use both, because there are differences again with them. TalkBack is honestly not quite as good as VoiceOver for the most part. TalkBack doesn't always follow some of the conventions that have been established, like skipping null alt attributes and such, or it'll try and it'll focus too many things. But occasionally it does pick up things that VoiceOver doesn't, so it is always good to test with both. Compatibility is kind of an important thing, is because there are also occasions where something works in a certain browser and it doesn't in other browsers. We had that issue one time with testing a form with Firefox, where for whatever reason the screen reader wasn't reading the label, VoiceOver wasn't reading the label correctly in Firefox. But if we went to Safari or Chrome or whatever, it read perfectly fine. So be aware of those things and bring those up to, if you're working with a developer or something, bring that to their attention. Sometimes they're not able to fix that because it's actually on the browser's end, but they need to be aware of it in case there is something they can do, or they have someone they can talk to at those other companies. Some controls and tips for mobile screen reader testing. Instead of tab or shift tab or arrow keys, you're swiping left or right with one finger in order to move to the next or previous element. In order to activate anything, you have to double tap. If you're working on the keyboard, kind of the same way, you have to move around on the keyboard in order to move around, and then you have to double tap in order to actually activate a thing. Android has what is called the context menu, and that's how you are able to move through just headings or just images or just links, or look for different landmarks, that kind of thing. And that's activated by moving essentially an upwards or upside down L. You go up and then left, or up and left, or up and then right. If you're on iOS, that is actually known as the rotor menu, and that is opened by using two fingers, kind of spaced about, I would say, a quarter or maybe even a nickel apart, and turning clockwise. And that'll open the menu and it'll let you switch to what type of element you want to hear and focus on. They both have tutorials that you can run through, and they'll explain different gestures and what other things to do. You're looking for the same things primarily as you were on desktop with a screen reader. Just you're mostly trying to look for any behavioral differences in focus and interaction. As I mentioned earlier, TalkBack might sometimes ignore things like null alt attributes, because by default it kind of just focuses everything. Occasionally, like we said, that nav menu works perfectly fine on desktop, but on mobile there's a reading order problem because that open close button to actually get to it is earlier in the DOM order or later or something. Depending on how the site kind of reflows or resizes, that might change how things are interacted with. You might find yourself skipping around with the screen reader, and that's a problem. So just looking for those differences and such, depending on what you're testing with first. Okay, validation assessment. So this is where we've gotten the report, we've done fixes, and now we need to check that they actually happened. The way we do this, Andrew and myself, after someone has said, okay, we fixed our things, we only focus on the critical and recommended items, because those are the ones that are A, required by the law, and then B, are the ones that actually are really causing problems for accessibility. So we just go back and double check that those have been fixed sufficiently. If they haven't, or if they've been done and there's a way to improve it, we'll make those suggestions and add those to our report. Sometimes we'll also try and give examples of code snippets or directions to particular techniques, like the ones we've been talking about before, if that remediation hasn't been sufficiently addressed. Occasionally, we do come across new issues that popped up when we're testing. That when we're doing validation, we only go to those specific line items, but occasionally a new issue arises when we're trying to do what we were doing before. And so we'll make sure that people are aware of those things, because we don't want to ignore new issues. This always follows a conformance review or accessibility conformance review. Usually happens when vendors state they've completed remediation. If you're doing any testing on your own, this is something you want to make sure. You're essentially just double checking that, yes, this has been fixed and has been fixed sufficiently. So that's why the validation step is really necessary. With that, I am done as well, and Andrew will be finishing up our presentation.
Thank you, Stephen. So for our IT people, we're at our final sprint, last few slides. The last few minutes, just kind of wrapping things up, and we're focused on some best practices that would be great to integrate into your work environment. Things to consider. This is big focuses on content creators. So if you guys are charged with creating content for your agency, office, or initiative, really important that content creators are trained in accessibility, so they learn how to make They learn the basics of web accessibility. They learn how to create accessible documents, whether that's Word documents, PDFs, Excel files, slide decks. Make sure they make sure whatever they put out there is accessible for everybody. Establish a step in the process before you push that content out to the world, just to double check to make sure accessibility is in place. Even though you have been using the accessibility checker in the various tools, it's key that there's a last double check just before it goes live. Then if there's, for those who are on the web development side, and those who are focused on coding, making sure that you adjust your coding and best coding writing practices to incorporate accessibility testing throughout the dev cycle, not just before the final sprint. So throughout the process, ideally having a user with a disability, if you've got one on staff, that'd be great. If you don't, it would be, great to make sure you get some accessibility testing done. Again, persona testing is fantastic. If you have the opportunity, we do have lots of good testing resources shared today. Obviously it's just super key that we make sure that there's significant accessibility testing done before any product goes live. Universal design. So we've previously touched on this principles of universal design. We need to make sure that the products and services and IT solutions that we put out there, are a good user experience. So people with and without disabilities can access those IT solutions without the need for workarounds, and accommodations. Again, you need to consider what content you're trying to deliver, and make sure that can be delivered and digested by people with cognitive disabilities, folks with ADHD, learning disabilities, or what have you. It's really important that, again, just reference back to that plain English wherever possible, write pragmatically and put out content that's pragmatic and makes sense. Good coding, accessibility testing, good user experience, these benefit everybody, not just people with disabilities. Makes the site better, makes the application better, makes your content more user-friendly. It's going to be better digested by everyone. Some useful tools. We have Cadet up there for video captioning. We have fantastic accessibility checkers in place with the Microsoft Suite, and obviously Adobe Acrobat. We have HTML validators. W3C has one. There's also allow you to go in there and check forms and links and all of the good stuff like that in HTML validators. We've also thrown lots of good, Stephen was very kind to throw lots of good resources up in chat as well. So again, we're Maryland Department of Disabilities. We are here to assist. So providing those kind of on-demand trainings, monthly training sessions, special training sessions like this. This is this type of half-day seminar. This is the type of thing that we'll probably offer, once or twice a year if you can get to it. There will be another iteration of this training. Will likely be more focused on content creators next time. So we'll step away from the coding aspect and more focused on, those content creators and those people who are pushing out lots of information for the public. We do consults. We provide lots of advice. We do evaluation and validation testing of websites for accessibility and websites and IT solutions. We do obviously procurement support, and we are Stephen and I are the two states SMEs for digital accessibility. Our emails on the screen right there, and obviously there's a link there to subscribe. Everyone who has attended the session today and those who signed up and who weren't able to get here, everyone has a copy of the handout and of the slide deck. If anyone has any questions, now is the time to answer. It'll either be myself or Stephen answering the questions. So kind of just open floor format. You can, if you just want to type the questions in the chat, that's totally fine in the Q&A. Yeah, but the floor is open.
I think that was the last slide. Yeah. We were recording this today, by the way. It will take a while to process, but we can host that up for people. When we send out the follow-up email in a few days, we'll include all of the links, and we'll include the slide deck and handout again, just to make sure everyone got it. And we'll also probably provide some additional information as well.
Stephen, we have a question from Rachel here.
Yep. If we include an expand title on our website so that additional information may be viewed, if the dropdown is selected, will this comply with WCAG? So what title does, what the title attribute does, is you want to put that on a link or something in order to give people additional information, like opens a new window or something. If you're talking about ARIA expanded, though, what that does is tell a user, yes, okay, when you click, this, when they first focus it, they'll hear, this topic, and then they'll hear collapsed. And then when they activate it, they'll hear, this topic expanded. So it'll let them know that a new section is open. So yes, that would be compliant. I will tell you though, if you're talking about the HTML attribute title, just make sure that you don't repeat anything with, like if you have like a name in link text or something, like a division in your agency, if you put that again in the title, it's going to read both at people, and that's not a WCAG violation, but it's one of those user friendliness things of, I don't want to hear, welcome to Maryland Department of Disabilities, welcome to Maryland Department of Disabilities, because we put both the title and link text there. Does that make sense? I hope so. It does. Okay. This would be used to capture a report title in which the dropdown will capture, for example, 2020 report, 2019 report. Yes. Okay. Yeah, that is where ARIA expanded is what you're looking for, because that will tell users this is open or closed. So, yep, that would be the perfect way to use that. If you are working, if you're a state of Maryland employee in an agency here, and you're using Do It Web Services, it should automatically have that available for you, or it should automatically be added to it. So you shouldn't have to add it yourself, but it doesn't hurt to double check that it's there and that it's functioning correctly.
Stephen, we have some Pennsylvania and some DC government employees here as well.
Right, and that's why I just specified, state of Maryland person. I should also mention with ARIA expanded, you do need to make sure that you're putting it on the either the button that opens or closes it, or like the kind of whatever the parent is in the HTML. If you add it to you have like a paragraph tag inside the button, and you add it to the paragraph tag, it won't function. So just make sure you're aware of where you're adding it and that it actually works. It can be a little tricky at times because, if you start having lots of, inner HTML, it's going to get problematic. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you all for attending today. Like I said, the follow-up will come out in a few days, hopefully. The one suggestion about having a example website we'll look into, and we will, if you guys are on our mailing list, which I believe, or I hope all of you are, if not, please go subscribe. We'll send out information about that if we go forward with that. we'll leave the room up for a couple extra minutes in case people need to copy anything or have a last minute question. But otherwise, feel free to reach out at any time. We're here to help.
Yeah, and caption services are going to end right now in, well, about 30 seconds. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.